Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. There's a strange thing about black cats, something not quite right that slips beneath the skin, like a forgotten memory lingering at the edge of your mind. People say they're bad luck, and most people roll their eyes, dismissing the superstition as nonsense. But there's a part of everyone that shudders when they hear the thud of a cat's paws on the floor at night, especially if it's a black one. It's as if you can almost sense that something is watching, something waiting. Andrew never thought much of it when he first saw the cat. He was standing at a bus stop one gray morning, waiting for the ride to work, and it appeared from nowhere. Just a little creature with a coat as dark as pitch, its eyes gleaming yellow in the dim light. It sat on the sidewalk, staring at him with an intensity that made Andrew feel uncomfortable, like he was being examined in some alien way. A chill ran down his spine, but it was only for a moment. He didn't know why he felt it, but he was sure of one thing. The cat was there for a reason. Over the next few days, the cat appeared more frequently. It seemed to be everywhere. Outside his office building, sitting by his car in the parking lot, even at the end of his street when he walked home. Andrew's initial unease grew into a quiet curiosity. Cats were, after all, independent creatures. Maybe this one had adopted him, as cats sometimes did. Or maybe it was simply following its instincts, attracted to a person who, for reasons unknown, could provide some kind of companionship. It had a lean, angular body and an odd grace to its movements. And its eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, seemed to pierce right through him, as if it could see something he wasn't even aware of. It wasn't long before Andrew decided to bring the cat home. He didn't have any particular reason. He just found himself unable to shake the feeling that the cat needed him. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to provide that. The first night the cat stayed in his apartment, Andrew barely noticed the difference. It was just another creature, one more thing to share space with. He opened a can of food, set it down in the corner of his living room, and the cat ate, quiet and still, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of the world. The apartment, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of a rundown building, seemed to absorb the cat's presence. There was nothing remarkable about it, except that once the cat arrived, the air in the room felt a little thicker, a little heavier. But that night, Andrew couldn't sleep. The cat wasn't the cause. He was used to animals, used to the little things that made noise when they moved. But it wasn't the sound that bothered him. It was the silence that followed it. It was strange, unnatural even, but it was as if something had been erased, something that shouldn't have been erased, that had always been there in the dark spaces of the room, was now missing. He sat up in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside, and his mind wandered back to that first night he had seen the cat. What was it doing here? Why him? A sudden chill passed through the room, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked toward the window, but it was shut tight. The air conditioning was off. The heat of the night oppressive in the way it could be in early spring. He glanced over at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by. It was only 3 in the morning, and yet he felt as though time was moving slower than it should. And then he heard it, soft, rhythmic, like the sound of small paws against the wooden floor. Andrew froze, his breath caught in his chest. He had been expecting it. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but somewhere deep inside, he had been waiting for that moment. The moment when he would hear the cat moving around in the dark, just as he had heard it move before in the dead of night. But something was different about it this time. The sound of the cat's paws padding across the floor was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't the lazy, casual wandering of a cat, stretching its limbs, exploring the room. It was more like the pacing of something trapped, something waiting, something that couldn't get comfortable. Andrew pulled the covers tighter around him, trying to keep his heart from racing. The sound was coming from the foot of the bed now, moving closer, just out of sight. He could feel it there, feel the weight of the cat, its presence pressing into the room like an unseen weight. He tried to reach out and turn on the light, but his hand felt like it was made of stone, too heavy to lift. The pacing stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He waited. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, inch by inch, something cold pressed against the edge of the bed. He held his breath, waiting for it to pass, waiting for the cat to slip away, back into the shadows, back to its usual place in the dark corners of the room. But it didn't. It stayed. And then he heard it. A soft sound, a sound that didn't belong. A low, rumbling purr. Andrew's eyes snapped open wide. The purring wasn't like any cat's purring. It was deeper, more guttural, almost as though it was coming from somewhere farther away. The cat's presence filled the room in a way it hadn't before. It felt unnatural, wrong. And yet, Andrew couldn't move, couldn't scream. The purring deepened, reverberating through his body, like a slow, steady vibration that pressed down on him. Then, without warning, the cat jumped onto the bed. Andrew gasped, his body freezing as the weight of the cat settled onto the mattress. He could feel the cold press of its paws on his legs, but he couldn't bring himself to open his eyes. He knew that if he did, if he looked down, he would see something that would stay with him forever. He didn't have to look. He could already feel it. The sensation of those glowing yellow eyes boring into him from the dark. He could feel them now, even with his eyes shut. He could feel them drilling into his skull. The purring ceased. For a long moment, there was nothing but the weight of the silence pressing down on him, suffocating him. He felt paralyzed, trapped in the stillness of the room. The cat was there. He knew it, and it wasn't leaving. And that was when he heard something else, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, like a breath too soft to be caught on the wind. A voice, and in the stillness of the night, Andrew could just make out the words, "You shouldn't have brought me here. You shouldn't have brought me here." The words echoed in Andrew's mind, like a distant bell tolling in the fog, but they didn't make sense. His heart was hammering now, his body stiff, paralyzed with fear. His eyes remained tightly shut, the weight of the cat still pressing against his legs, its presence far too heavy for something so small. He could feel the blackness of the room closing in on him, the silence suffocating him in ways he'd never felt before. It was as if the very air had thickened, becoming something darker, thicker, like tar. The whisper came again. "You shouldn't have brought me here." The voice was strange, familiar, yet not. It wasn't the soft, rumbling sound of a cat's purr. It was deeper, thicker, as though it carried a weight, an ancient sorrow that clung to it. It was as if something far older than any creature, any animal, was reaching out to him through the guise of a black cat. His breath hitched. The cat had been silent for moments now, but the room felt alive. He could sense it, feel it, somewhere just out of his reach. Something watching him, something waiting. He opened his eyes slowly, cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The apartment was dark, the soft light from the street lamps outside casting long shadows against the walls. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for an early spring night. But it wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. It was the oppressive stillness that filled the space, the feeling that something had shifted. Something was no longer right. His gaze moved to the foot of the bed. The cat wasn't there anymore. Andrew's heart leaped into his throat. The bed felt unnaturally cold now, colder than before. But the strangest part was the way the room felt, empty, as though the cat's presence had created a vacuum, pulling everything into a deep, hollow quiet. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up, to move. His muscles screamed in protest, stiff and unwilling. But he had to know where the cat had gone. There was no sound, no scratching of paws against the floor, no rustle of fur. The apartment was so silent now that it felt as though he were suffocating in the void. Where the hell did it go? He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and reached for the lamp on the nightstand. His hand trembled as he flicked the switch, casting a dim yellow glow around the room. The shadows stretched long, flickering across the walls. But nothing. There was no sign of the cat, no movement, no eyes watching him from the corners, just the hum of the city outside. The cat had always been quiet, but now there was something unsettling in that silence, something wrong. He glanced toward the door of the apartment. It was shut, locked. No way the cat could have slipped out, at least not without him noticing. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Just a cat, he muttered to himself, his voice thin, unsure. It felt like a lie. He knew it was a lie, and yet part of him couldn't help but wonder if he was imagining the entire thing. Maybe it was all in his head, the weight of stress from work, the loneliness of his life catching up with him. A stray cat, nothing more. It wasn't like he was dealing with some supernatural force or an ancient evil. Or was he? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a soft scuffling noise coming from somewhere behind him. He whipped around, his heart in his throat, eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. Nothing, just shadows, stretching and shifting like liquid, as if the darkness itself was breathing. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, a tiny scrape against the floor. Andrew stood up abruptly, his legs unsteady, as he moved toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the closet, barely audible beneath the thumping of his own pulse. He gritted his teeth, trying to silence the panic crawling up his throat. This was ridiculous. It was just a cat, just an animal, nothing more, nothing to be afraid of. But the scuffling continued, scratching against the hardwood floor. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Andrew slowly stepped toward the closet door, his breath shallow, heart pounding. His fingers reached for the handle, cold and stiff beneath his touch. The door groaned as he pulled it open, revealing nothing but dark emptiness. His eyes searched the space, heart racing, desperate for any sign of movement, any flicker of life. And there it was, a flash of yellow eyes. They glowed like twin lanterns in the dark, staring at him from the farthest corner of the closet, just beyond the hanging coats. The cat's fur blended into the shadows, its form barely discernible. But those eyes were unmistakable. "Jesus," Andrew whispered, taking a step back. His breath hitched as he backed away from the door, hands trembling. But the cat didn't move. It stayed in the shadows, staring at him with a calm, unsettling gaze. And in that moment, Andrew felt something deep in his chest, something cold, something heavy. It was as if the cat had found a way to crawl inside him, to burrow deep into his soul. The air around him felt tight, suffocating, like he couldn't escape, like the room was closing in, the walls pressing inward. His stomach turned as he took another step back, bumping into the dresser. The cat's eyes never left him. They burned through him with an intensity he couldn't explain. And then, as if in response to his fear, the cat's tail twitched. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, as if they were alive, moving, breathing. And then the whisper came again. "You're mine now." It was quieter this time, almost a sigh. But Andrew heard it clearly, felt it vibrate through the very core of his being. His breath caught in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He felt it then, something far beyond the cat, something ancient and terrible, stirring in the room with him. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. The air was too thick, too heavy. The room had become a cage, the walls pressing in on him as the cat's eyes burned like fire. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the cat blinked once, and the eyes were gone. The room fell silent again, save for the pounding of Andrew's heart. He turned, looking frantically around the room, but there was no sign of the cat. The closet was empty. The apartment was still. For a moment, Andrew thought he might be going insane, but the cold, sticky fear crawling under his skin told him otherwise. He wasn't imagining this. The cat was still there, watching him, waiting, and it wasn't going to leave. The silence of the apartment pressed in on Andrew, thick and oppressive, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the walls are closing in, like the air itself is plotting against you. His body was rigid, stiff, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The cat, where did it go? He glanced around the room, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes. Everything was exactly as it had been moments before, yet it felt so wrong. The emptiness was suffocating. It's just a cat. The thought whispered through his mind, but it didn't hold the weight it once did. The words felt hollow, empty, as though they were spoken by someone else, a stranger. And deep down, he knew he wasn't fooling anyone. He wasn't fooling himself. Andrew didn't want to believe it, but there was something else in the room now, something far older than any animal, something ancient that had been watching him from the shadows. It was like a creeping, insidious presence that had slithered into his life, and now it was nesting inside him, making him feel different, not quite himself. He sat down at the edge of his bed, hands trembling as he rubbed his face, trying to calm himself. The cool sweat on his skin felt like it was freezing him from the inside out. His eyes darted back toward the closet, the place where the cat had been only moments before. The dark corner seemed to beckon to him, like a hole in the fabric of the room. But there was nothing there, nothing but the lingering chill. Then he noticed it, a scratch, barely visible, on his wrist, a thin line of red that hadn't been there before. He hadn't noticed it when he'd first gotten out of bed, but now, in the dim light, it was unmistakable. He lifted his wrist to his face, the blood slowly drying along the delicate skin, the wound shallow but sharp, like something had raked across it. But there was no memory of it happening, no recollection of the moment it appeared. Andrew's heart dropped into his stomach, his hand trembling as he wiped the blood away. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a trick of the night, his mind playing games on him. But that was the problem. His mind was playing tricks on him. The last few days, ever since the cat had shown up, felt like a fever dream, reality bending and warping in strange ways. Was he imagining it? Was he losing his grip on sanity? Or had he really brought something into his home that shouldn't have been there? The voice came again. It's not over. It wasn't a whisper this time. Number this time, it was loud, like a slow, rumbling growl that reverberated through his chest. The hairs on his neck stood up, his pulse quickening as he turned toward the source. The room was still dark, the only light the faint yellow glow from the street lamp outside. But he could feel the eyes on him, those burning, unblinking eyes, cutting through the shadows like a hot knife. Andrew jumped up from the bed, the words, the voice. It was real. There was no denying it. He wasn't going insane. There was something here with him, something that had been with him since the moment that cat stepped into his life. The whisper, the growl, it wasn't from the cat. Not completely. The voice was too deep, too ancient, like a roar from a time before the world had been born. It had been there all along, waiting for him, watching him. It had been inside him the whole time. And then he heard it again. A light scratching sound, too faint to be the cat's claws, but something else, a scraping, like fingernails, dragging against the inside of his skull. Turn around. It was a command, a simple instruction. And somehow, against every instinct, he obeyed. The room behind him seemed darker now, a void where the shadows twisted and turned. The darkness crept toward him, pooling like oil on the floor, stretching long fingers up the walls. He felt it, the pull, the tug at the edges of his mind. The room itself felt like it was bending, warping under the weight of something far too old, far too powerful. And there, at the foot of the bed, the cat appeared again. This time, it was different. It was sitting upright, its body still, its eyes glowing like twin lanterns. But there was no mistaking the change. The way the cat sat, perfectly still, unnaturally so, was wrong. The way it seemed to watch him, not with curiosity, but with something else, something dark and primal. The fur around its face seemed to bristle, more like the rough hide of a beast than the soft coat of a pet. And in that moment, Andrew understood. This wasn't a cat, not really. It was something far worse. You shouldn't have called me, it whispered, its voice now not coming from its mouth, but from the very air around him, curling inside his skull like smoke. Andrew's blood ran cold. He took a step back, his hand scrambling for something, anything to steady himself. His legs were weak, shaking, and he could barely find the strength to breathe. The air in the room was growing thick again, suffocating. I didn't call you," he muttered under his breath, but even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. He had called it in his own way. He had brought it here. The cat's lips curled back in a strange, twisted grin. The teeth gleamed. Too many. Too sharp. Its tail twitched, swishing back and forth with a sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. "You did," it purred. The sound was like a rumbling from the deepest pits of the earth. "And now, you'll suffer the consequences." A knot twisted in Andrew's gut. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The words were right there, but they wouldn't come. And then the darkness around the cat began to shift, swirling like smoke around its body until the room seemed to blur. It wasn't the cat anymore. Not completely. The cat had become something else, something much larger, its form flickering in and out of reality, like a nightmare trying to tear itself free. And then the cat's eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, focused on him. The air around Andrew grew colder, biting into his skin. His breath came out in quick, sharp gasps. He felt it, something cold, something ancient, crawling inside his veins, pulling at him like invisible strings. "You'll be mine forever," the voice whispered again. Only this time, it wasn't in his mind. It was in the room, swirling in the air around him. The shadows thickened, and Andrew knew. He knew that the cat wasn't just a pet. It was a harbinger, a thing that had been waiting for the right moment to claim him. Before he could move, before he could scream or run, the cat sprang. And Andrew fell to his knees as the world around him twisted into darkness. The darkness came for him, but not in the way he expected. At first, it was just a feeling, a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. His body locked in place, unable to move, paralyzed by something far deeper than fear. The air had turned thick and cold, a biting frost that numbed his bones, and the shadows, those endless, creeping shadows, seemed to have taken on a life of their own. They wrapped around him like fingers, curling in tight, pulling him in. The cat's eyes were still there, those haunting, glowing eyes, burning through the darkness. But they weren't just staring anymore. They were pulling him in, dragging him, binding him to the floor, trapping him in a web of unspoken dread. Every breath he tried to take was stifled, suffocated by the weight of the room, by the air that had become impossibly thick, as though it were made of something darker, something far worse than simple night. Andrew tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, unable to escape. His mouth frozen shut, as if by some invisible force. His muscles spasmed, his limbs stiffened, and all he could do was stare into the burning, unblinking eyes of the black cat. The room around him seemed to blur, like watercolors bleeding together in the rain, and the shadows seemed to crawl, twisting and writhing, wrapping themselves around his arms, his legs, his chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. Andrew gasped for air, sucking in a ragged breath as his limbs loosened, and he found himself able to move again, though his body still felt strangely heavy, like the gravity in the room had shifted. His chest heaved, his heart pounding erratically as he scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, searching for the cat, but it was gone. Just like that. Gone. But the air hadn't cleared. No, the suffocating weight remained, pressing in on him, suffusing every corner of the apartment. The shadows were still there, pooling around him, thick and oppressive, like they were closing in on him, moving in waves. And in the center of it all, he could feel it. The presence, that ancient thing that had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't crazy. This thing, this cat, was no longer just a creature of flesh and bone. It was something else entirely, something older than the earth, something born of the darkness itself. Andrew stumbled backward, his breath quick and shallow. He could hear the faintest whisper in the air, curling through the silence. His eyes flicked to the closet, to the shadows where the cat had been, and he knew that it wasn't done with him yet. It had been waiting, watching. He had invited it in, hadn't he, with that first hesitant step, that first glance into its eyes. And now it had a hold on him, a terrible hold, one he couldn't break. But how? How could he escape? How could he rid himself of whatever had latched onto him? The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't just a growl. It was a roar, deep and guttural, echoing in the very bones of the apartment, shaking the walls as if the earth itself were trembling. The sound felt like it was coming from all directions, as though the room itself were alive, pressing in from every corner, every crevice. "You're mine now." Andrew squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it only got louder, the words carving into his skull. His hands shot up to his ears, but it didn't help. It was inside him now, echoing in his mind, consuming his thoughts, filling him with that cold dread that he couldn't shake. He was losing control. Everything was slipping away from him. There's no escape. The words seemed to freeze him in place. His feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, unable to move, unable to break free. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel the presence of something so much bigger than the cat, something ancient and vast, wrapping its tendrils around him, claiming him. And then the shadows shifted. They moved, not in the way shadows should, but like living things. Andrew turned, his eyes wide with terror, and that's when he saw it. The cat was back, but this time it wasn't just a cat. No, it had grown. It had expanded, its form distorted and monstrous. Its fur seemed to writhe like liquid darkness, its body stretching unnaturally, bulging in places it shouldn't. It was taller now, its back arched in a way that made its head almost touch the ceiling. Its tail was like a whip, snapping in the air with a sound that made his blood run cold. And those eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, they weren't just eyes anymore. They were glaring into his soul, peering into places no living being should see, revealing things that were better left unseen. Andrew's legs finally gave out, and he crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. The cat's eyes followed him as he sank to his knees, its gaze unblinking, as if it were savoring his terror. The room seemed to grow darker still, the shadows stretching toward him, pulling him into their embrace. "You've done it now." The voice was a low, satisfied growl, like thunder rolling across a stormy sky. "You can never leave." Andrew's mouth went dry. His mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? What had he done? The air in the room thickened again, this time with an oppressive weight that felt like the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were something else, something far more sinister. The walls of his apartment seemed to shimmer, bending, distorting, as if they were no longer bound by the rules of physics. It was happening. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. The cat, the thing that was no longer just a cat, was taking him, It had already claimed him, and now it was pulling him down into the abyss. "Come with me," it whispered, and the words seemed to wrap around him, tightening like a noose. Andrew reached out, his hand trembling, but it wasn't for escape. He could feel it, the pull of something far darker than he was ready to understand, something that had been waiting for him. It wasn't the cat that was the true horror. It was the thing behind the cat, the thing that had been pulling the strings all along. His vision blurred as he looked up one final time at the creature before him, and then, without warning, the darkness consumed him. Andrew's mind swam in the void. Time had become a twisted, unrecognizable thing, like water that had been stirred too many times, its surface broken and chaotic. He couldn't remember where he was, couldn't remember who he was. The shadows that had engulfed him were now his entire world, wrapping around him like a second skin, a living thing that breathed with him, moved with him. There was no escape, no sanctuary, only the unrelenting pull of that darkness. He wasn't sure if his eyes were still open, or if it was just the weight of the blackness inside him. He could feel it, a cold, aching emptiness where his soul should have been. And there, in the deepest recesses of his mind, the cat's voice echoed. "You belong to me now." It wasn't a statement. It was a command, a cold, undeniable truth. The words shattered the remnants of his consciousness, and he struggled to breathe. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the dark, swallowed by the void around him. His heart raced in his chest, each beat feeling like it was tearing him apart from the inside out. His body felt strange, foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him, like it had been replaced by something else, something other. Is this death? The thought hovered, just out of reach, like a whispered prayer that he couldn't quite grasp. He had no idea how long he had been trapped in the suffocating blackness. Hours? Days? A lifetime. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the suffocating presence that filled the void, that hung in the air like an ancient storm waiting to break. "You're mine," the voice whispered again. "I will never let you go." Andrew's eyes snapped open. He was no longer in the apartment. He could feel the cold concrete beneath him, the dampness of the air that seemed to seep into his bones. The shadows were still there, but they were not the same. They weren't just lurking in the corners of the room. They were alive. They swirled around him, pulsating like a heartbeat. And from the center of it all, the cat stood, staring down at him. But it wasn't just a cat anymore. No, it had changed. It had become something far worse. Its eyes were still glowing yellow, but now there was something more, something deeper, something ancient that seemed to reach into the very marrow of his bones. The cat's fur was slick, like liquid night, and it moved in a way that was both feline and unnatural. Its limbs twitched and snapped at odd angles, as though it was struggling to maintain the shape of an animal, but was failing. The creature was bigger. The shadows around it grew long, curling and twisting into grotesque shapes, reaching out for Andrew, pulling him closer. The air crackled with an electric charge, a sense of impending doom that made his skin crawl. Andrew tried to move, tried to pull himself away, but his body refused to obey. The shadows were holding him in place, constricting around his limbs like chains of ice. He felt the cold seep into his skin, into his soul, as the darkness closed in. "Why do you resist?" the cat asked, its voice now a rasping, guttural sound that echoed in his mind. "You can never escape me." The walls of the room, if it could even be called a room, began to warp. The concrete began to twist and distort, stretching like taffy, the floor buckling beneath him, the ceiling sagging as if the very structure of the world was being undone. He could hear the walls whispering now, a low murmur, like the voice of the darkness itself. The shadows that had once been his prison now felt like his prison, a cage from which there was no escape. Andrew's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His chest felt tight, his lungs refusing to fill with air. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a reminder that he was still alive, but barely. "You will learn," the cat continued, its voice slipping in and out of his mind. "The price of your soul, the price of this bargain." The word bargain struck him like a knife. The realization came slowly, creeping like ice in his veins. The cat hadn't just taken him. It hadn't just trapped him here in this nightmare. Number Id had bought him. The cat's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time since this began, Andrew understood. The creature wasn't just some random malicious entity that had decided to terrorize him for sport. Number the cat had been waiting for him, waiting for the right moment. It had found him, chosen him. The deal had been made the moment Andrew took it in, brought it into his home, offered it sanctuary. He had invited this thing, this darkness, into his life, never once considering the cost of that invitation. It had been subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a sense of unease that had grown over time. And now it was here, pulling him down into its depths. And there was no escape, not for him, not for anyone who had dared to call the beast into their world. "You should never have invited me in," the cat purred, its voice thick with malice and satisfaction. "Now, you will be mine forever. You will serve me, just like all the others." Andrew closed his eyes, his mind reeling. His breath hitched in his throat. The truth was there, inescapable, pressing against his skull like a vice. This was the price. He had brought the cat into his home. He had welcomed it, and in return, it had claimed him, body and soul. There was no bargaining. There was no pleading. There was only the eternal dark, the endless shadow that stretched before him, swallowing him whole. "You are mine," the cat repeated, "forever." And with those final words, the darkness consumed him. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. She couldn't really say for sure. The days had started to blur together, each one another indistinguishable layer of exhaustion, soaked with the weight of too many hours and not enough sleep. The only constant was the subway. It was always there, the rhythm of it, the cold metal rails winding beneath the city like veins in a monstrous organism. The train was a place she knew well, the steel behemoth that carried her through the dark, the unspoken promise of safety, anonymity, and a little solitude. It was a routine, a ritual, every night, the same. She'd walk to the station, swipe her card, step into the train, and let her mind drift as the world outside passed by in flashes. Most nights, she'd stare out the window at the flickering station lights or the dull yellow glow of the subway tunnels, lost in thought. But tonight, there was a subtle unease, a tickle at the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. It was just one of those nights, a night when something felt just a little off. Evelyn Richards had no explanation for it. She wasn't a superstitious person, and if someone had asked her just moments ago, she would have said it was nothing more than the stress of too many deadlines, too many hours spent glued to her desk. Yet here she was, standing at the bottom of the stairs leading into the station, her breath coming out in little puffs in the cold air. The hairs on the back of her neck was standing up, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't quite put her finger on. She glanced at the station, which was quieter than usual. The air felt too cold, the platform too empty. There were no crowds today, no office workers rushing to catch the next train home. The place was almost deserted, save for a few solitary figures, hunched in their coats, their heads bent toward their phones. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, looking down the length of the platform, then took a deep breath and walked forward, deciding to board the next train. She didn't want to be out in the cold much longer. The train arrived with its usual screech of metal against metal, the doors sliding open with a hiss, and she stepped inside. The smell of musty air and old coffee was familiar, like a second home. The train was half empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. Most of the city's commuters had already gone home, and only a few stragglers remained. She found an empty seat near the window, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, her fingers wrapped around her bag. The low hum of the train's engines vibrated beneath her feet, a sound she'd come to associate with comfort. But tonight felt different. The air was too still, too quiet. She looked around at the other passengers, the usual faces, people who had the same routine as her, the same late-night schedules. But there was something unsettling about them tonight. The man sitting across from her, for instance, his eyes were wide open, but they were glazed, unfocused, as if he wasn't actually seeing anything. His head was slightly tilted, as if listening to some distant sound she couldn't hear. Next to him, a woman with unkempt hair and a gray scarf wrapped around her neck was sitting completely still, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was pale, her lips pursed as if she was deep in thought, or perhaps trapped in some unseen grip. Evelyn felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the emptiness of the car, the coldness that clung to everything, or the way the other passengers didn't seem to notice her at all. It was as if they were all there, but not really there, as if they were only echoes of people, shadows of the real thing. She looked at her own reflection in the glass and wondered if she was a shadow too, just passing through, one foot in this world and the other somewhere else. The train lurched forward, the movement jerking her from her thoughts. She watched the fluorescent lights above flicker as the tunnel stretched on, swallowing them whole. The usual announcement came over the speaker, the same monotone voice telling everyone that the next stop was City Center and to remain behind the yellow line. But as the train continued through the tunnel, the stations began to look unfamiliar, their names illegible, their signs covered in grime. Was this the right route? Evelyn tried to remember which train she had gotten on. Was it the one that took her home? She glanced at the map above the door. The stops should have been flashing by, one after another, but they weren't. There were no stations. There was nothing but darkness outside the windows, just the relentless, winding tracks leading deeper into the unknown. Her heart began to race, a fluttering panic rising in her chest. She looked around again at the other passengers. They hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged her discomfort. Their eyes were empty, vacant, staring into space, It was as if they couldn't see her, as if they couldn't see anything. She tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was curling in her stomach. Maybe it was just her imagination, her overactive mind. It had been a long day, too long, and now it was starting to catch up with her. She needed to get off the train, but it was just so quiet, so empty. Maybe if I just ask someone where we are, I'll feel better. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her, and moved toward the nearest door. She didn't know why, but the thought of being trapped on this train, not knowing where it was going, was starting to make her feel claustrophobic. Her hand wrapped around the cold metal bar by the door, and she tried to pull it open. The door didn't budge. She pulled harder, panic starting to spread across her chest like wildfire. "Excuse me," she said, turning to the man sitting next to her. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, but there was no recognition, no sign of understanding. His lips barely moved as he whispered something, but his voice was so faint she couldn't make it out. His mouth curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth behind it, just the coldness of something unnatural. The train rattled louder, and for a moment she thought she could hear something more, something beneath the sound of the train, like a distant rumble, almost like a growl. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and then, just as quickly, the sound stopped. But something had changed. She wasn't sure what, but she felt it deep in her bones, the unmistakable sensation that something was wrong, something far worse than just a late-night train ride. The lights flickered again. The station signs outside the windows were gone entirely now, replaced by dark, cavernous stretches of track. She was no longer sure if they were even still underground. The train sped on, relentless, hurtling forward into the unknown, and she wasn't sure whether she wanted to find out what lay ahead, or if she would ever be able to escape it. Evelyn stood there, gripping the cold metal bar, her fingers numb from the icy sensation that seemed to seep from the walls of the train itself. The panic that had fluttered in her chest like a moth's wings had now taken root in her stomach, turning it into a knotted mess of fear. Her thoughts were scattered, like pages from a book that had been tossed in the wind. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't breathe properly. She tugged at the door handle again, harder this time. It had to open. The last thing she wanted was to be trapped here, trapped in this oppressive, suffocating train, surrounded by passengers who stared at nothing, who weren't really there at all. Her reflection in the glass opposite her was ghostly, and for a brief moment, she wondered if maybe she wasn't really there either. The thought, as ridiculous as it was, didn't seem as far-fetched as it once had. She could barely even remember what had brought her onto this train in the first place. She'd gotten on at the usual stop, hadn't she? Wasn't that where she was supposed to be going? But the track ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the shadows outside had grown thicker, deeper. She couldn't even see the exit lights anymore, just the relentless, ever-hungry darkness. Her hand trembled as she let go of the handle, unable to force the door open. She took a step back and scanned the train. The same dismal faces stared back at her, their eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. There was something wrong with them, the same as before. Their vacant stares, the stillness of their posture. They weren't alive, not in the way people were supposed to be. She could feel their eyes on her now, just the faintest tug of attention that seemed to flicker before vanishing again, as though they were aware of her, but just enough to keep her unsettled. They didn't speak, didn't move, and that, more than anything, gnawed at her. The train lurched again, its grinding wheels sending a shiver down her spine. She grabbed hold of the nearest pole to steady herself, her knuckles white with the strain. The rattling continued, intensifying as the tunnel outside grew darker, deeper. There was no station, no sign of life. The train was moving faster now. The landscape outside the window, nothing but a blur of blackness and twisted shadows. Evelyn turned back to the passengers. A woman a few rows ahead of her had shifted slightly, a faint twitch that could have been a movement, or could have been her imagination. Evelyn blinked, but the woman was still, unnervingly still. Her throat went dry. What was happening to her? Was she losing her mind? Was the stress finally catching up to her, blurring the lines between reality and some fevered hallucination? She didn't know, but she needed to get out of here. She needed to find a way off this train. A bell rang, a harsh, jarring noise, and Evelyn's breath caught. She spun toward the front of the train, expecting to see some sign of where they were, but there was nothing. No announcement, no voice from the speaker overhead, just the eerie silence that blanketed the car. The same silence that had taken root in the passengers, leaving them paralyzed in their seats. Evelyn pressed her hands to her ears. The silence was deafening, and the longer she was trapped inside this moving coffin, the more suffocating it became. She needed to leave. She needed to know what was happening, why she was here, why no one seemed to notice that the train wasn't stopping. It was then that she noticed something else, a shift in the air, subtle at first, like a ripple across still water. The train slowed, the faintest shuddering of the wheels, as if they were about to come to a stop. Her heart leaped, her breath catching in her chest. Finally, she hurried to the door again, her fingers fumbling against the cold handle. She pulled with all her might. The doors didn't budge. No hiss, no movement. She slammed her palm against the metal, her mind reeling with frustration and desperation. Her eyes darted to the windows. The lights outside were gone completely now, replaced by an endless stretch of black tunnel. There were no stations, no signs of any kind, just the oppressive, consuming darkness. She was moving deeper into it. The train wasn't stopping, and it wasn't slowing. It was as though the world had been consumed by the dark maw of this tunnel, and she was the only one left to scream. But no one would hear her. No one could. The other passengers, they were still. They didn't even seem to breathe. Their bodies were rigid, their faces painted with expressions too blank to be human. Evelyn let go of the door in defeat and sank back onto the seat. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to calm down, to think logically. This isn't real, she told herself. It's not real. This is just stress, just fatigue. But the thought offered her no comfort. Her hands were trembling now, and when she opened her eyes again, she was hit with a terrifying realization. The passengers weren't staring at the empty space ahead of them anymore. They were staring at her. Every single one of them. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. They didn't move. No one shifted. No one even blinked. Their eyes were wide open, fixed on her, empty of life, but filled with something far darker. And then the man across from her, a man she hadn't noticed before, spoke. His voice was a rasping whisper, too soft to be heard over the noise of the train, but it reached her nonetheless. You shouldn't have gotten on. The words sliced through the air like a razor. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Before she could react, the lights flickered above, plunging them into darkness for just a second. When the lights returned, she felt something else. Something else was here now. There was a pressure in the air, as if the train wasn't just moving through tunnels, but was sinking deeper into something alive. The train jerked violently, as though it had been kicked by some unseen force. Evelyn's body was thrown sideways, her hands scrambling to grab hold of anything to steady herself. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on, and Evelyn was no longer alone in the dark. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, as if something was breathing too close, just out of reach. Evelyn sat frozen in her seat, the cold metal beneath her palms sending tremors through her fingers. The flickering lights, once a faint annoyance, had become a reminder of how utterly alone she was, how utterly trapped she was in this endless train, moving further away from any kind of safety. The train, this monstrous thing, was alive. She could feel it now, pulsing like some great, heartless organism with no intention of ever stopping. And the passengers, they stared at her, every single one of them. Not one blinked, not one moved. Their gazes were as cold as the empty tracks outside the window. It was as if they were not people anymore, but mannequins, hollow shells of former lives. The man who had spoken earlier, his raspy whisper still lingering in her ears, hadn't moved either. His words hung in the air, curling around her like smoke. You shouldn't have gotten on. The phrase kept repeating itself in her mind, over and over again, like some broken record. A warning? A curse? Was it a prediction of something terrible? Something worse that awaited her? Evelyn didn't know, but every fiber of her being screamed for her to move, to get out. But where could she go? The doors remained locked, and the windows were nothing but blackened glass, showing her nothing but the suffocating void outside. She turned to the other passengers. They hadn't moved. They never did. Their stares, their dead eyes, bored into her. But now, something was different. A strange pull gripped her chest, a twisting sensation that made her throat tighten. The temperature in the car had dropped further, the chill seeping into her bones. She shivered, the hairs on her arms standing on end. It was so cold now, so damn cold, and yet it wasn't the kind of cold she had ever felt before. It wasn't the dry, biting cold of the winter air, or the damp chill that clung to the subway tunnels. This was different. This cold had weight. It pressed against her skin, as if the very air around her was suffocating her, trying to drag her into the dark. Then she heard it, a faint sound, a scratch. No, not just one. A series of them, rapid like claws against metal. A scraping noise, faint but growing louder. The sound seemed to come from beneath the floor, as if something or someone was crawling through the dark, underneath the train's very structure. Evelyn's heart leaped in her chest. She glanced quickly at the other passengers. They were still motionless, still locked in place, their expressions frozen in that same eerie blankness. None of them seemed to notice the noise. It wasn't normal. It couldn't be. Her eyes darted to the door again, hoping against hope that she might somehow escape. It has to open, she thought. It has to. This isn't real. It can't be real. The scraping sound grew louder, more intense. Evelyn pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady her breath, but it was becoming harder to focus. The cold was unbearable now, and her limbs felt heavy, as if the darkness outside the window had somehow bled into the train and was weighing her down. The sensation in her chest, the fear that had begun as a simple flutter, was now a full-fledged panic. Her pulse raced as the train rattled, its rhythmic clatter growing more erratic. The scraping continued. It sounded closer now, like something crawling through the vents, slithering just below her feet. Her eyes shot to the man across from her, the one who had spoken. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were fixed on her now, unwavering, almost predatory. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Why are you staring at me?" she thought, but she couldn't voice the question. She was rooted to her seat, unable to look away from his unblinking gaze. The scraping sound ceased abruptly, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible thud. Evelyn's heart stuttered in her chest. What the hell is happening? Without thinking, her legs moved on their own accord, and before she knew it, she was stumbling down the aisle toward the front of the train. She didn't even know where she was going. She didn't care. She just needed to move. She needed to get away from the passengers, from the oppressive silence, from the ever-growing terror gnawing at her mind. She reached the door and grabbed for the handle once again. This time it budged, just slightly, as if mocking her. Her fingers tightened around the cold metal, and with a final, desperate tug, she pulled the door open, only to be met with the same unrelenting darkness. The air outside was thick, like smoke, pressing in on her. She could hear something now, a low, guttural hum vibrating from the depths of the train, shaking her bones. She stepped into the threshold, her feet skimming the edge of the door frame. But before she could take another step, the door slammed shut with an earth-shaking crash, throwing her backward into the seat. She hit the floor hard, her breath knocked out of her as pain shot up her spine. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, and when she opened her eyes, something was different. The man who had been staring at her was standing now, his face mere inches from hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he whispered again, this time right next to her ear. His voice was cold, but his words, they wrapped around her like a vice, tightening until she couldn't breathe. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling back, her hands trembling. What did he mean? What the hell is happening? But there was no time for answers. The train had stopped. At last, after what seemed like an eternity of motion, it had come to a halt. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. She rushed toward the doors once more, her fingers clawing at the cold metal, but they didn't budge. Not a single movement, not a sound. The train was still. Then, through the foggy glass, she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the platform. The dim, ghostly outline of a person. A woman. Her face was obscured by shadow, but her posture was unnervingly still. Her head tilted slightly, and Evelyn's breath caught as the woman's eyes, wide, hollow, and black, locked with hers. And just like that, Evelyn knew. She knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that whatever had been following her, whatever had been pulling her into this nightmare, had just found her, and it wasn't letting her go. Evelyn's blood ran cold as her eyes locked onto the shadowy figure standing at the far end of the platform. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink. Her pulse hammered in her chest, and all she could hear was the thumping of her heart as it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the train. The figure, the woman, stood motionless, her features obscured by the eerie glow of the distant station lights. All Evelyn could make out were her eyes, hollow, black, unblinking. She's waiting for me. The thought drilled into Evelyn's mind like a jagged shard of glass lodged in her skull. A pull, dark and irresistible, seemed to come from that figure, tugging at her very soul. She couldn't look away, couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was standing there in the shadows wasn't just waiting, but expecting her. A wave of nausea surged through her, her stomach tightening in protest. What does she want? The question echoed in her mind, but the answer came immediately. I don't want to know. The train remained still, locked in place, and the silence around her was suffocating. It was as though time had stopped, as if the very world had taken a deep breath and held it in anticipation. She could hear the faintest hum beneath her feet, like the train's engine was still running, still alive, but she could no longer tell if it was just in her head. The woman didn't move. She didn't even breathe. But her eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, were fixed on Evelyn, and Evelyn knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was the one the woman was waiting for. Suddenly, the train jolted. A violent tremor shook the metal beneath Evelyn's feet, and for a moment, she thought the car might tear apart. She stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her as she crashed to the floor, her hands scraping against the cold surface. A muffled scream of terror clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the deafening sound of Evelyn's rapid breathing and the pounding of her heart in her ears. And then, with a sickening thud, the lights came back on. The woman on the platform was gone. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with sweat, her vision swimming. She couldn't process what had just happened. One moment, the woman had been there, her eyes boring into Evelyn's very soul, and the next, she was gone. Had she imagined it? Was it just another trick of the train's sickening atmosphere? Or had the woman somehow disappeared into the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever? No, that wasn't possible. Evelyn refused to believe it. She had seen the woman, felt her presence. The air had thickened when their gazes had locked. The space around her heavy with something more than just physical weight. It had been something other. The train began to move again, the grinding sound of its wheels against the tracks breaking through the tense silence. It started slowly, as if it were unsure of itself, hesitant, and then, as if it had been waiting for something, waiting for her to make a decision, it surged forward with a deafening roar. The walls rattled, the floor trembled beneath her feet. Evelyn's body was once again thrown sideways, her hands gripping the nearest pole for stability. The speed picked up quickly, faster than she could process. It was as though the train was in a race against something, a something that was chasing it, hunting it, pulling it forward with an unstoppable force. She glanced toward the front of the train, her eyes wide and frantic. The windows were now opaque, a ghostly fog clinging to the glass. The outside world was a blur of motion and shadows, and yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was still watching her, that something was following her. Even in the fleeting moments when the train was still, the pull of that presence hung in the air like a dark cloud, oppressive and suffocating. Evelyn's mind spun. She had to make sense of all this. had to understand what was happening before it was too late. There had to be an explanation. She was going mad, or the train was malfunctioning, or maybe she had died, and this was purgatory. But if that was true, then where was the exit? Where was the way out? She looked again at the other passengers. They were still there, still frozen in place, their vacant stares locked on nothing in particular. But something was different now. There was a shift in the way they sat, a tension in the stillness that hadn't been there before. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She could feel it, a weight on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The man who had spoken earlier, the one with the cold eyes, was watching her again. His gaze wasn't just directed at her now. It was almost intentional, as if he were trying to draw her in, pulling her deeper into his web. The hairs on the back of Evelyn's neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Get off this train, the thought whispered in her mind, like an echo from some distant, forgotten voice. Get off before it's too late. She had to get off. She had to find a way out. But as she moved down the aisle, the train picked up speed again, the force of it pushing her back toward her seat. Her legs felt heavy, as if the train were dragging her along. She fought against it, forcing her body to move, but it was like walking against a strong wind, a wind that seemed to grow stronger the further she went. There was no way to escape, no way to stop it. The doors were locked, the windows opaque, the passengers around her, lifeless, hollow, their eyes following her every move. She's not real. The thought came suddenly, a chilling realization slithering through her thoughts. The woman on the platform, the one with the black, empty eyes, she wasn't real. Not in the way Evelyn had thought. She was part of it, a part of this thing, this train, this journey. Whatever it was, whatever this place was, it was not bound by the rules of the real world. The train lurched again, its momentum almost pushing her off her feet. She slammed against the side of the car, her body bouncing violently. Her mind was reeling. What do I do? How do I get off? And before she could even try to steady herself, a voice broke through the chaos. It was a whisper, but it wasn't like the others. It was close, too close. We've been waiting for you. Evelyn froze, her blood running cold. The voice came from behind her. She didn't dare turn around. Evelyn's legs buckled beneath her. The voice, that low, haunting whisper, sliced through the pounding rhythm of her heart. We've been waiting for you. She couldn't move. The weight of the words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She could feel it. Something alive, something dark, crawling closer. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around her. The train had become something else, something more sinister. It wasn't just taking her somewhere, it was dragging her, like a predator, to its lair. She had been waiting. That was the terrifying part. All of this, the train, the passengers, the eyes that never blinked, it was all for her. It wasn't random. She wasn't just some lost soul caught in a malfunctioning subway system. No, she was the destination. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her mind was a blur of panic and terror, her body trembling violently as she clung to the edge of the nearest seat. She needed to escape. She had to. But no matter how hard she tried, her legs wouldn't move. The train had her now. Her gaze flicked to the other passengers. They hadn't moved, hadn't even reacted to the voice. They were all still as statues, their dead eyes staring ahead, waiting for something. She didn't know what, but she felt it, a dark presence among them, like something was living inside them. These weren't ordinary people. They couldn't be. They were all part of the same thing, a web of souls caught in the endless motion of this train. And the man, the one who had spoken before, he was still watching her, still there, sitting motionless, his eyes cold, unblinking. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry. No sound would escape. There was no escape. "We've been waiting for you," the voice repeated, this time louder, closer. "It's time to come home." The words chilled her to the bone. Home. What did that mean? Was this some twisted version of reality? Was she dead, caught in some hellish afterlife, riding a train that would never stop? Every inch of her screamed no, but her body refused to obey. The train lurched again, its roar deafening. The sudden force threw Evelyn forward, her head smashing against the window with a sickening crack. Pain exploded in her skull, but it didn't matter. The world outside the window had changed. It wasn't a blur of tunnels and darkness anymore. It was something other. The sky outside was deep, endless black, lit only by distant, flickering lights that seemed to flicker like dying stars. There were no buildings, no roads, no people, just a train cutting through an infinite abyss. The platform where the woman had stood, the woman with the black eyes, was gone. There was nothing left but endless night. Was this where it was taking her? The thought burned through her brain, sharp and clear. She had known it all along, hadn't she? There was no escape, no stop. The train was a vessel, and it was taking her somewhere terrible, somewhere she had no control over. She had been pulled into its orbit, trapped in its motion, and now there was no way out. Her body shook violently, her hands reaching out to the seat next to her, clutching it as if it could somehow anchor her to reality. The cold that had been creeping into her bones was unbearable now, crawling beneath her skin, freezing her from the inside out. She was certain she would lose herself to the darkness soon. If she didn't stop it, if she didn't stop it right now, there would be no way back. Evelyn turned toward the front of the train, her eyes wild. She had to do something, anything. She didn't know how much longer she could take this, how much longer she could endure the endless motion, the endless weight of it pressing in on her. She had to make it stop. But as she moved toward the front of the car, something shifted. A figure appeared in the doorway ahead of her, tall, cloaked in shadow. It was the woman again, the one with the hollow eyes. Her face was still obscured, but the feeling of knowing crept up Evelyn's spine, suffocating her. She could feel the woman's presence before she even saw her, could feel the weight of her stare. "You've been waiting for so long," the woman said, her voice low, a distant echo. "Now, it's your turn." Evelyn took a step back, a scream building in her throat. The woman moved closer, gliding toward her with unnatural ease. Her feet never seemed to touch the floor, her steps soundless. But it wasn't the woman that terrified Evelyn now. No, it was the others, the passengers. They were moving now, slowly, mechanically, like marionettes with invisible strings pulling them forward. Each of them stood, their bodies jerking as if moving against their will, their dead eyes still locked on Evelyn. The man who had spoken earlier was among them. He was standing too, and now he was moving toward her, his gaze piercing, cold, filled with that same emptiness that had first chilled her bones. Evelyn felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. This wasn't just a train. It was a trap. It had been leading her here all along, to this moment, to this realization. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. She was one of them now. Trapped in the same endless motion, bound to the train, bound to the abyss. The woman reached out, her hand cold as ice, brushing Evelyn's cheek with a touch so light it might have been imagined. But Evelyn knew. It wasn't imagined. She could feel the cold burning through her skin. And in that moment, as the darkness of the train seemed to swallow her whole, Evelyn understood. This was where it had all been leading. This was where it always led. She wasn't a passenger. She was the destination. The train wasn't carrying her anywhere. It was taking her home, and she wasn't the first. The woman's eyes, hollow and endless, locked onto Evelyn's, and in a final, twisted moment of clarity, Evelyn saw it. The truth. The passengers weren't just passengers. They were lost souls, each one waiting, each one part of the same eternal ride. And now, Evelyn was one of them. The train lurched again, the screech of its wheels on the tracks louder than ever, and the lights above her flickered once more, casting the train in an eerie, hellish glow. And then the doors closed. Evelyn wasn't going anywhere. The first time it happened, it was nothing more than a curiosity. The kind of thing parents dismissed when they saw their child doing something strange, a phase, something fleeting. It was easy to explain away. And so, when the whispers began, neither Rebecca nor James thought much of it. At least, not at first. It was late, far later than any child should still be awake. The house was silent, the kind of silence that had a weight to it. The air felt thick with the kind of quiet that creeps in after dark, when the house has settled into its creaks and moans. A calm before the storm, perhaps, or a calm just before something unnatural. Rebecca had been reading in the living room, the soft hum of the air conditioner, the only sound when she first heard it. It was faint, just a whisper, really. So faint she thought it was part of her own thoughts. But it wasn't her voice, and it wasn't in English. She put down her book and listened, straining to hear it again, the sound of a child murmuring. She frowned and stood, crossing the hall to the nursery. Inside, the light from the hallway spilled across the room. There, in the crib, her son, only 4 years old, lay with his back to her. His little body was motionless, his breathing slow and steady, as though he were asleep. Yet, from the shadows behind him, there came that faint sound again. Words, incomprehensible, tumbling out of his mouth. Rebecca's breath caught. It wasn't just nonsense. It was an actual language, one she didn't recognize. It wasn't a jumble of baby noises or random gibberish. This sounded purposeful, structured, almost deliberate. She stepped closer to the crib, her bare feet quiet on the wooden floor. Her son, Caleb, never stirred, even as his lips parted slightly and the words continued. It was as if he were speaking to someone or something beyond the room, beyond the walls. The shadows, it seemed, held something more than just darkness. Caleb, she whispered softly, her voice a gentle pull. Caleb, honey. There was no response. Sweetheart, are you awake? The murmuring stopped. For a long moment, nothing. Just the soft, slow rhythm of his breathing, his tiny chest rising and falling under the weight of sleep. Rebecca leaned in closer, her heart racing, uncertainty pooling in her stomach. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was nothing more than the hum of her own imagination. And then it happened again. The murmuring returned, but this time it wasn't just words. There was something else there, something unsettling in the tone. It wasn't the innocent sound of a child speaking in their sleep. It wasn't playful or light. It was dark. The words came in a rush this time, a series of harsh syllables, strung together like an incantation, too fast for Rebecca to make sense of. There was a sound underneath the words, too, a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Rebecca staggered back, her breath coming out in shallow gasps. The room felt colder. Her eyes darted to the window, where the shadows outside seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow on the grass beyond. She didn't know why she was looking there, but it felt important. There was something out there, something that wasn't right. Caleb's murmuring continued, as if he were still unaware of her presence. His small hands twisted beneath his blanket, and for the first time, Rebecca noticed something strange. His fingers weren't moving in the usual way of a child caught in the grasp of some dream. No, they were moving in unnatural, deliberate patterns, like someone directing them, guiding his hands in some twisted dance. Rebecca's breath hitched in her chest. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to wake him, but something deep inside her told her to wait, to just watch. What was happening to her son? What was he saying? The words continued, garbled and deep, like a chant, and Rebecca's mind flashed with an unsettling thought. What if he wasn't speaking to her? What if he wasn't speaking to anyone in the room at all? A cold chill crept up her spine. She stood there, motionless, staring at Caleb, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. The sound of his voice was so foreign, so strange, that she couldn't make it fit in her world. It was as though it came from some place outside of her comprehension, a place that shouldn't exist. A sudden shift in the air made her freeze. The temperature in the room dropped, not by a few degrees, but by a significant amount, enough to make her breath cloud in the air. The hair on her arm stood up. Something was in the room with them. It wasn't her son's voice anymore. It was something else. Rebecca took a shaky step back, feeling the weight of the presence surrounding her. The shadows at the edges of the room grew darker. She turned to leave, but her foot hit the leg of the crib. The noise broke through the strange atmosphere, like a slap, loud in the silence. Caleb's eyes snapped open. They were pitch black, no whites, no color, just voids. His pupils were wide, swallowing the entire eye, until it looked as though his eyes had been overtaken by shadows, the blackness too deep to even comprehend. Rebecca gasped, her breath leaving her in a strangled rush. The moment she stepped back, Caleb's tiny hand shot up, grasping her wrist with unnatural strength. "Don't go," he rasped, his voice no longer childlike, but low and harsh, like something far older, far more malevolent. Rebecca recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. It wasn't his small hand anymore. It was the hand of something else, something far stronger than any child should possess. "We've been waiting," Caleb murmured, his voice twisted in a way that made Rebecca's stomach churn. The words weren't even in a language she recognized anymore. They were backwards. The realization hit her like a freight train. She jerked her wrist away with a desperate pull, and the grip loosened. Caleb's eyes blinked, slowly returning to their normal state, as if nothing had happened. His hand dropped back to his side, his breathing softening once again as he fell back into a peaceful sleep. Rebecca stumbled out of the room, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, her body trembling. She had to tell James. He had to know what was happening. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. She spent hours pacing the small, dimly lit hallway, her mind spinning with thoughts that never seemed to settle. It had to have been a nightmare, some grotesque, twisted dream she'd imagined, one of those awful ones that seem so real but fade when the sun rises. But she had seen Caleb. She had heard him, and what was worse, she had felt it. That thing, that presence, the cold that crept into her chest, like a hand tightening around her heart. She was still holding her breath when she heard James stirring in the bedroom. His heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor signaled that he was awake, probably wondering what was going on. The house had been far too quiet, far too still. She couldn't bring herself to wake him, not yet. She didn't know how to explain it. How could she tell him? How could she make him understand that their son had become something else? The air in the hallway was thick, heavy with the weight of her thoughts. She walked back to the nursery door, her hand lingering on the cold brass doorknob. She stood there for a long while, listening to the silence inside. The shadows in the room were deep, stretching across the floor like something alive. Everything was still, but it was the kind of stillness that pressed down on you, like a pressure in your chest. The house had a way of whispering, creaking, and groaning in its sleep. And tonight, the silence seemed more oppressive than usual. Finally, Rebecca pushed the door open, just a crack. She had to see for herself. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Caleb was still in his crib, his small form curled beneath a blanket. For a moment, she allowed herself to think that maybe it had all been a dream. But then she heard it again, that whisper. It wasn't as soft as before. This time, the words were more distinct, like a command, a forceful plea. Rebecca's heart began to race, and she pulled the door open wider, careful not to make a sound. Her eyes searched the room, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Caleb lay on his back, his tiny body still, but his lips were moving again, and that strange, backward language was spilling out of him like liquid, each syllable more unsettling than the last. And there was something else, something worse. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to be shifting. Just a slight movement at first, too small to notice unless you were looking for it. A wisp of blackness slithered along the edges of the walls, curling and twisting like smoke, dark against the faint glow of the nightlight. It was moving. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The movement wasn't natural. It wasn't the kind of shadow that existed just because the light cast an odd shape on the wall. Number. This was something alive. She could feel it, a pull, like the shadow was reaching for her, beckoning her closer. She stepped back, her body trembling, but her eyes remained fixed on Caleb. He was still talking, the strange language flowing from him, almost too fast to follow. His voice laced with an unnatural hollow sound. And then, as though on cue, the whispering stopped. Caleb fell silent, his breathing slow and steady once again. For a few seconds, everything was still. And then, with a sudden, unnatural jerk, Caleb's head turned sharply to the side. Rebecca froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched her son, his small face now angled toward the shadow in the corner of the room. His black eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with innocence, were wide and unblinking, like two dark voids staring into the blackness. And then, without warning, his lips parted again. But this time, he didn't speak the strange language. Instead, his voice rang out clear and distinct, in perfect, flawless English. "It's time," he said, his voice deep and flat. "They're coming for you." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She had heard him speak before, in his child's voice, but this wasn't her son's voice. This was something else, something that didn't belong. Before she could react, a sound came from behind her, like a footstep, slow, deliberate. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The hallway was still, no one there, but she knew. She knew someone, or something, was standing just out of sight, watching her from the darkness. She rushed to Caleb's side, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Caleb," she whispered desperately, her hands shaking as she reached down to touch his face. He didn't respond. He was still, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room. His lips were still parted, as though waiting for something, waiting for someone. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if reaching toward her. Rebecca grabbed Caleb from his crib and pulled him close, feeling the coldness in his little body, colder than it should have been for a child his age. His skin felt like ice. She held him tightly against her, her mind spinning. The words from earlier, the ones that had filled her head in a rush, came back to her, clear and unrelenting. "They're coming for you." Rebecca's heart clenched. She needed to get out of there. She needed to get Caleb away from whatever had taken hold of him. She couldn't wait for James any longer. She had to act now. She took a step back, then another, her breath shallow, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. She could feel the presence in the room, feel the weight of the air pressing down on her. The shadows were closing in. She turned toward the door, her pulse racing, and that's when she heard it. A whisper, a soft slithering sound. It came from the corner again, just behind the crib, and this time it was unmistakable. The words weren't in any language Rebecca knew. They weren't in anything familiar. They were backward. It was the same chant that Caleb had been muttering earlier, the one that made no sense. Rebecca spun around, clutching Caleb to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows in the room were moving. No, shifting, as though something was pressing against them from the other side. And in the darkness, she could just make out the faintest outline of a figure, a shape. It wasn't human. It was tall, thin, too tall for anything she had ever seen. Its limbs were stretched, its silhouette shifting like smoke, and its eyes were the same blackness that had taken over Caleb's gaze. The thing in the shadows smiled. Rebecca didn't remember how she had gotten to the door. Her feet moved on their own, dragging her away from that thing in the shadows. It was like she had stepped into a nightmare, each step muffled, as if the air around her had thickened, pressing in on her with unbearable weight. The small crib, the nightlight, the shadow, that all seemed so distant now. She was no longer standing in the nursery, but in the long, silent hallway that stretched out before her. But her mind couldn't settle. Her heart hammered as if it were trying to break through her chest. Her Her son was different. What had happened to him? What had that thing done to him? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something much worse than just a child's fevered dream. This wasn't a passing thing. No, this was something much darker, a nightmare that had taken root in the flesh of her child. Still clutching Caleb tightly, she made her way to the stairs, her thoughts spinning faster than she could follow. She needed to get to James. She needed to tell him what had happened. She needed someone to see it, someone to confirm that she hadn't lost her mind. But even as her feet carried her down the stairs, she knew that the thing she'd seen in Caleb's room, whatever it was, wasn't going to leave her alone. It had already taken root in their house, and it was waiting. The shadows seemed to follow her, stretching, crawling along the walls. She could hear something behind her now, a soft rustling sound, as if the air itself were alive, breathing. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the living room. James was on the couch, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had been up late working the night before, and it was clear he hadn't gotten much rest. He groggily turned his head as he heard her approach, his eyes bleary from sleep. "Rebecca?" he mumbled, sitting up slowly. His voice was thick, still heavy with sleep. "What's going on? You're shaking. Are you all right?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. "Is everything okay with Caleb?" James asked again, his brow furrowing in concern as he noticed how tight her grip was on their son. He started to rise from the couch, but then froze, his gaze darting to Caleb's face. The boy was still asleep in her arms, his expression peaceful, as though nothing had happened. Rebecca's throat tightened. Had he seen it too? Had James seen the shadows, the black eyes, the whispers? But when she opened her mouth to speak, she found herself unable to form any words. Her breath caught in her chest, her heart racing again as she tried to find the right words. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at James, feeling the heavy weight of her words before she could even say them. "James, something's wrong with Caleb. Something's happening to him." James took a step forward, his face softening. He reached for her, trying to pull her into his arms. "Rebecca, slow down. What are you saying? You're scaring me." "I'm not scared, James," she said, her voice rising in panic. She couldn't contain it anymore. "I'm telling you, Caleb's he's not the same. He's speaking. He's speaking in another language. It's like he's talking to something else in the room. I saw it. James, I saw it too. The shadows, the eyes." She trailed off, realizing how crazy she sounded. He would never believe her. How could he? James looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and concern. He was a good man, a caring father. But this was beyond anything either of them had ever faced. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at Caleb, whose small body remained still. His eyes closed in innocent sleep. Then, slowly, James reached for his phone, his hands trembling. "Don't," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice low but sharp. "Rebecca, I have to call someone," James said. He wasn't arguing, but he didn't understand. "Not yet. We need help. We can't. No," she hissed, her voice breaking. "Don't call anyone. They'll take him, James. They'll take Caleb. I know they will." James's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? I don't know who they are. I don't know what it is, but I saw it. I felt it in that room." She pressed Caleb closer to her chest, her hands shaking violently. It's already here, and it wants him. James took a step back, as if her words had physically pushed him away. What are you saying? You're scaring me. I'm not scared, James, Rebecca repeated, almost as if to convince herself. I'm telling you, Caleb is different. You didn't see his eyes. You didn't hear what he said. What did he say? James's voice was quiet, almost afraid to ask. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew the truth. She had to say it. He said, "It's time. They're coming for you." James's face paled, his mouth going dry. Rebecca's mind was still reeling from the terrifying events of that night. It felt like there was no way out, no way to escape the dread that had begun to fester in their home. The thing that had taken hold of Caleb wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let them go. It wasn't going to let Caleb go. Suddenly, she felt a shift in the air. The temperature dropped, like the wind had changed direction, pulling all warmth from the room. She looked around frantically, feeling an eerie sense of déjà vu. The shadows in the corners of the living room were stretching again. They were growing darker, larger. They were creeping along the walls, like smoke, like something that wanted to consume everything. And then she heard it, an unmistakable sound, a whisper, soft but insistent, coming from the far corner of the room. It's too late. The voice was low, familiar, but not her own, not James's. It was something else. Rebecca froze. James's eyes were locked on her, confusion and fear spreading across his face. He couldn't hear it. He couldn't feel it. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. Rebecca didn't have an answer. She couldn't explain what was happening. She couldn't even begin to comprehend it. But she knew one thing. Whatever had taken Caleb, whatever was watching them from the darkness, wasn't finished yet. It was just getting started. Rebecca's hands trembled as she held Caleb close, his small, fragile body feeling like ice against her chest. She could still hear the whispers, soft at first, like a murmur in the back of her mind, but they were growing louder, closer, more insistent. "It's too late." That voice again. It wasn't Caleb's. It wasn't hers. It wasn't even James's. It was something else, something wrong, like a shadow trying to claw its way into the world. A voice from the walls, from the corners of their house, from somewhere deep and far beyond the realm of the living. It had no origin, no direction, no face, and it knew her. Rebecca's body jerked as a sharp cold wind swept through the room. The air around her felt thick, saturated with a suffocating heaviness, as if the world itself had gone still. The temperature had dropped even further. She could see her breath in short, misty puffs. Something was wrong. Something was watching them. Something was waiting. James was still standing there, his face pale, a look of confusion and disbelief spreading across his features. His eyes flicked to the walls, to the corners of the room, as if expecting the shadows to move. "Did you hear that?" Rebecca's voice cracked as she looked at him. She knew he hadn't heard it, not the whispers, not the growing voices that now seemed to echo through the very walls. "Hear what?" he asked, his voice trembling. He glanced at the door, the hallway outside. "Rebecca, this isn't like you. Maybe you need to sit down for a minute." But Rebecca couldn't sit down. She couldn't stop moving. Every bone in her body screamed at her to leave, to run, to get Caleb out of this house. But she couldn't. Something held her there, rooted to the spot, her eyes locked onto her husband's face, searching for some sign that he understood, what was happening. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The house went quiet. Too quiet. Rebecca's gaze darted back to Caleb. His eyes were open now, wide and unblinking. They were still black, unusual, unnatural, those empty, hollow eyes that no longer belonged to her son. He didn't blink, didn't stir. He just stared ahead, his mouth slightly parted, as if waiting for something. Rebecca's heart beat in her throat. She stepped closer to the crib, placing her hand on Caleb's forehead. He was cold, unnaturally so, cold as the grave, and yet his eyes were wide, unblinking. She felt an icy chill wash over her, and in that moment, she knew whatever had taken him was still there, still waiting. It wasn't just the shadows that lingered in the corners. It was the house itself. The walls, the floors, and the very air. It all knew. It knew Caleb, and it knew her. Rebecca stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Caleb. She couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense. Her son had changed. But into what? And what was waiting in the darkness? The soft sound of a door creaking broke through her thoughts, a dull groan of wood that made her jump. She spun around to see James stepping back, his face pale and full of dread. The door to the living room had opened on its own. No wind, no draft, just the door creaking open, as if something unseen had touched it. "James," Rebecca whispered, her voice hoarse. "Did you hear it? It's not just the voices. It's the house. It's alive." James didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind her, past her shoulder, to the far corner of the room, where the darkness had gathered once again. It was no longer just a shadow. It had taken shape, shifting in the low light, becoming something far more solid. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. Rebecca's stomach churned. Something moved inside the darkness, something long and thin, slithering, twisting like a nightmare-made flesh. It was as though the shadows themselves were crawling toward her, curling around her ankles, dragging at her feet. "James," she said again, her voice a strained whisper. I see it," he replied, his voice breaking. She turned, her gaze locking onto the shape in the corner. It was growing, stretching, as if it were pulling itself from the walls. A cold, unnatural silence filled the room. But the thing in the corner had no shape, no face. All Rebecca could see were those eyes, those deep, empty pits of blackness. The thing didn't move in the way something alive should. It simply hung there, suspended between the walls, a presence that seemed to drain the very light from the room. The shadows writhed like hungry serpents. Caleb had gone silent, his unblinking stare still fixed on the darkness. He wasn't crying, wasn't making a sound. It was as if he was no longer aware of the world around him. He was just staring, waiting. Rebecca stepped forward, her heart beating faster with each step. "Caleb," she whispered. She reached for him, but as her fingers brushed his skin, she froze. His skin was cold, too cold. His body felt rigid, like a doll, his bones stiff. It wasn't her son anymore. With a cold, sinking feeling in her chest, Rebecca understood. Whatever had been inside Caleb's body had taken root. It was no longer her son in that crib. It was something else, something that had wrapped itself inside him, like a parasite. And then, as if the room had heard her thoughts, the shadows in the corner twitched, and the voice spoke again. This time, it was louder, clearer, as if it had crawled up from the depths of the earth itself. "It is your time." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to face James, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't say anything, didn't make a move. He simply stood there, paralyzed, staring into the dark. The voice wasn't coming from Caleb, but from everywhere. It filled the room, pressed against her ears like 100 whispers in her mind. She tried to speak, to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, helpless, as a shadowy figure in the corner began to move. It was no longer a vague silhouette. Now it was growing, stretching, its long limbs contorting as it pulled itself from the walls, from the very air. The thing that had been a shadow was now a twisted mass of limbs, eyes and shapes that should not be, its form shifting in impossible angles. And then, in a sickening moment of realization, Rebecca saw it. Behind the thing, rising out of the darkness, was Caleb. His small body was trembling, his black eyes unblinking as he raised his arms. His hands, long and bony, stretched outward toward her. It was him, but it was not him. The thing in the shadows had finally come for them. The room grew colder with each passing second. The shadows were no longer just a presence in the corners. They had taken shape, twisted and malformed, stretching like fingers that reached for anything they could claim. The very air seemed to vibrate with a terrible malignant energy. Rebecca stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her eyes never left Caleb. He was standing there now, his small frame like a puppet in the grip of some unseen force, his limbs stiff and unnatural. The blackness in his eyes had spread, consuming the whites entirely, until there was nothing but deep, endless darkness. The whispers, the voices, had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed in on her, suffocating her, thick with the weight of impending doom. Caleb's head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were listening to something far beyond her, beyond their world. And then he spoke. The words were not his own, not words he should have known. They tumbled from his mouth in a language Rebecca had never heard, a language that sounded ancient and terrible, like something from the deepest, forgotten corners of the earth. The sound twisted, scraping across her mind like nails on a blackboard. Her stomach turned. This was not Caleb. It was something else, something wearing his skin. And then, in a voice that echoed far too loudly for a child so small, the creature in Caleb's body whispered something in perfect English. "You should have left." It was not Caleb's voice. It was deep, distorted, hollow. Rebecca's body shook with the weight of terror, her limbs betraying her as she took an instinctive step back. Her eyes flicked to James, but he had not moved. His face was pale, his expression locked in some kind of trance, as he stared into the darkness that now consumed the room. He had heard it too. The warning, the threat, the inevitable. It was too late. "James!" Rebecca cried, her voice cracking. She stepped toward him, but before she could reach him, Caleb's figure lurched forward, arms stretched toward her. The thing, whatever it was trying to drag her in. Her heart slammed in her chest as her body responded without thinking, instinctively pulling Caleb's tiny, rigid body away. His skin was ice cold to the touch, his fingers like fragile twigs. It was as though he were made of something that was not flesh and bone. "It's not him anymore," Rebecca whispered to herself. She had to believe it. She had to. Caleb's head jerked toward her as she tried to pull him back, and for a brief, fleeting moment, his eyes, those black pits of emptiness, softened. Something human flickered in them. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the dark force that held him. The dark shape in the corner of the room began to move again, but this time it was not hiding. It was emerging. A mass of shadowy limbs and inhuman features crawled toward her. It was large, too large for this room, a towering mass of writhing limbs that twisted in impossible angles. Rebecca's mind couldn't process what she was seeing, and yet, in the core of her being, she knew that this creature had always been here, waiting, watching, patiently biding its time. It stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer, more distinct. Its face, or what should have been its face, was an expressionless void. Its eyes glowed with a cold, hollow light, like two stars dying in the blackness, and it stared at her, not just with eyes, but with something deeper, something ancient. Rebecca stumbled back, her breath shallow, her legs weak beneath her. She could feel the coldness now, an ice that had settled into her bones. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something far older, something that was beyond anything she could fight or understand. And then it spoke. Its voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, like whispers carried on a wind that came from nowhere. We waited. We have always waited. Rebecca's blood ran cold. This wasn't the voice of a person, or even of a thing she could recognize. It was the voice of a nightmare, an echo of something long buried beneath the world they knew. It spoke of waiting, of time, a stretch of time that did not bend or break like the passage of years. A time that simply was, existing outside the concept of now and then. "James," she whispered again, her voice thick with desperation. But he did not respond. Her gaze snapped to him, and her heart stopped for a moment as she saw him. James stood motionless, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open as if frozen in some kind of trance. He was no longer himself. The darkness had reached him, seeped into his skin like ink in water. His face was blank, empty, and behind him the shadows were shifting. The house itself was alive, with the terrible presence of what lay hidden inside it. The walls seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of some massive, slumbering creature. It was too much. The thing that had taken Caleb, that had twisted him into something monstrous, had spread to James. It was reaching for Rebecca too. The house, this place, had always been waiting for them. Rebecca's eyes flicked to the door. The hallway stretched before her like an endless void. She didn't know what she was seeing anymore. What was real? What wasn't? She was trapped in this nightmare, suffocated by it. And Caleb, the real Caleb, was still inside, buried beneath the surface of the thing that now wore his skin. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, I know you're in there. Please, come back." But the child who spoke backwards, the one who was not Caleb, tilted its head and stared at her. Its lips stretched into a twisted grin. And then, in a voice that wasn't Caleb's at all, it answered, "You can't save him. You can't save any of you." The thing lunged then, its black limbs stretching out faster than she could react. And before Rebecca could even scream, she felt the cold, crushing weight of it pull her into the darkness, into the thing that had always been waiting. The door to the outside world closed, leaving only silence, and the house alive with whispers. The child who spoke backwards was no longer her son. It was one of those nights that felt like it had been stretched too thin, hanging just above the horizon like a half moon waiting to collapse. The kind of night when everything seemed just a little too quiet, too still, And in that silence, there was always the suspicion that something was waiting just outside your line of sight. Something hungry. Beth Monroe had never been the superstitious type, but she found herself looking over her shoulder a lot these days. The dark had been creeping up on her, not in the usual way, but in an unsettling, insidious way. It wasn't the storm that rattled the windows of her study that night. It wasn't the way the rain seemed to come down in sheets, pushing against the glass like a force of nature. No, it was the manuscript. It had arrived in an unmarked envelope, the paper yellowed with age, and creased as though it had been handled by many hands before reaching her. She had thought little of it at first, just another odd package in a long string of them. Some fan, some oddity, some rejection slip she had missed reading the day before. Her life had long since devolved into a cycle of emails, drafts, and stacks of unopened correspondence. Still, this one felt different. Beth hadn't seen the return address at first. She had been too focused on the script that covered the surface of the envelope. A single word written in sharp, neat ink. Her name, Beth Monroe. She had ripped it open, expecting something mundane. Perhaps a letter, or a book from an aspiring writer trying to get her attention. But no. Inside the envelope, there was a folded manuscript, ragged around the edges, bound together by twine. It looked as though it had been pulled from the ashes of some forgotten fire. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. Beth felt a strange tingling sensation crawl up her spine, but she shrugged it off. Writers were used to odd things, weren't they? The world had a way of giving them a taste of its strange, inexplicable nature. But this was not a taste she had ever experienced before. The pages were old. The ink was dark and thick. Yet there was something about the way the words twisted on the page that made her pause. She glanced through the first few paragraphs. Tight, perfect prose, each word biting with tension. The opening line gripped her like a vice. Beth Monroe never knew she could be in two places at once until it began to happen. Beth paused, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She blinked, rereading the sentence, trying to convince herself it was some eerie coincidence. After all, her name was hardly uncommon. But the cold chill crawling across her skin refused to leave. The manuscript was not her own work. Not even close. The style was different, strangely hypnotic, and yet it felt familiar. The words started unraveling in her mind, each one pulling her deeper into the story, deeper into something she couldn't understand. Something tugged at her insides, as though the story was whispering to her, calling her into it. The longer she stared at the page, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own. The ink bled and rippled as though it were wet, though her fingers felt nothing unusual when they grazed over it. She rubbed her eyes, blinking several times in a futile attempt to rid herself of the foggy sensation that clouded her vision. And then the next line appeared. She had seen the storm outside her window, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the storm that was coming for her. It was something much worse. Beth's heart thudded in her chest. She glanced out the window. The rain hadn't let up, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the strange reflection in the glass, the distorted image of herself. She didn't look right. Not quite. The angle was all wrong. The lines of her body stretched out at odd, unrecognizable angles. She shook her head and snapped the manuscript shut, as if cutting off the connection. But the words still lingered. They were echoing inside her head, louder now, too loud. Her pulse quickened, and she tried to focus, tried to bring herself back to the present moment. But there it was again, the next line in the manuscript, the one she hadn't read aloud, but had somehow heard. Beth Monroe would regret ever opening the envelope. She would wish for the peace of ignorance, the safety of not knowing what lay ahead. But by then, it would be too late. Beth couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around her. The storm outside had started to intensify, the wind howling, rattling the window panes. But it wasn't the storm she feared. It was the words, those words, creeping into her soul. She set the manuscript aside, determined to shake off the unease. It was just a story, a strange, unsettling coincidence, perhaps, but it was just a story, nothing more. Or so she told herself. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It followed her as she moved across the room, as she poured herself a glass of water and tried to calm her nerves. It followed her like a shadow, a whisper in the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. Read on. Beth set the glass down on the table, the sound of it clinking against the wood, almost too sharp, too sudden in the oppressive silence of her study. The room felt heavy now, the air thick with an unnatural weight. She glanced back at the manuscript, still lying on the desk, the twine binding it like an ominous reminder. But the pull was too strong. Without thinking, she opened it again. She read. It wasn't the storm that would change her life. It was the moment she would wish she could take back. The moment when she would look into the mirror and see something staring back that was not her own reflection. Something else. Something that had been waiting for her, hidden beneath the surface of her reality, waiting to be awakened. Beth shuddered, a chill washing over her. She glanced back toward the mirror on the far wall of the room, as if expecting to see something, someone there. But there was nothing. The room was empty, quiet. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. A knock at the door shattered the silence, pulling her back to reality. She almost jumped out of her skin, her pulse racing. Her hand went to the manuscript, then paused. She glanced at the door. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't invited anyone over. And yet, the knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Beth stood up, her heart pounding. She hesitated, her mind racing. Maybe it was just her nerves. Maybe it was just someone delivering a package, or a neighbor with a question. She glanced at the manuscript once more, her hand shaking. She couldn't stop herself now. She opened the door, and when she did, she froze. No one was standing there, just a cold, empty night. But there, on the doorstep, was an envelope. It was sealed, just like the first one, but this time there was no name written on it. No address, only a single word. Beth. She closed the door slowly, the sound of it echoing in the quiet house. A feeling of dread spread over her like a dark cloud. Something wasn't right. Something was closing in. And as she stared at the new envelope in her hands, she knew deep down that it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Beth stood in her study, the door closed behind her, her hand still trembling around the strange envelope. The darkness outside the window seemed to deepen, pressing in on her as the storm raged. The wind howled, a constant wail that scraped against the house like a warning, as if nature itself was trying to get her attention. She stared at the envelope, the one that had been left on her doorstep, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She hadn't wanted to open it. She really hadn't. But the pull, the insistent, gnawing urge to know what was inside, was overwhelming. There was something about this envelope, something that felt wrong, and yet she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, with a hesitation that made her palms sweat, she tore open the seal. Inside, there was no manuscript this time, only a single sheet of paper, folded once. The edges were frayed, as if it had been crumpled and straightened more times than she could count. The paper was older than anything she had touched before. So old, in fact, it felt like it could crumble to dust at the slightest touch. The ink on the paper was faded, but it was still legible, still sharp enough to make her stomach twist as she read the message, written in block letters. You think you can escape the story? You are part of it now. You are already inside. Beth's heart skipped a beat. She read the words again, slower this time, as if daring herself to believe them. The words themselves were simple enough, but they carried weight, a presence that was almost palpable in the air around her, the faintest whisper of something unseen, something watching. She looked around the room, her breath catching in her throat, the familiar shelves stacked with books, the worn leather chair by the window, the half-empty coffee cup on her desk. It all felt so wrong, so alien, as though the room had shifted somehow. The shadows seemed longer, darker, crawling just at the edge of her vision, twitching and moving in ways they shouldn't. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and the walls were closing in. Beth quickly shoved the letter back into the envelope, stuffing it into a drawer at her desk. She had to do something, anything. She was spiraling. That much was obvious. This had to be some sick joke, or a prank, or even a mental breakdown. But there was no denying it. There was something about it, something she couldn't explain. This wasn't just some crazy person sending her fan mail. This was real, and it was happening to her. The sound of the wind outside intensified, a shrill howl that rattled the window panes. A low rumble of thunder followed, shaking the walls. It was as if the storm was rising, swelling with the intensity of something far darker. The shadows in the room seemed to flicker with every flash of lightning, growing longer, deeper. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something she couldn't see, but could only feel. It was closing in, just like the words on the page had said. She pushed herself away from the desk, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that made her teeth clench. She had to get out of the study. She had to stop thinking about it, stop feeling it. She needed air, space, anything to ground her. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the door, but her eyes couldn't seem to tear themselves away from the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to be gathering. They weren't normal shadows. There was a presence in them, something alive, something watching. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she crossed the room, but she didn't dare turn around. The last thing she wanted was to look into the corner and see the thing that was lurking there. She reached the door, her hand on the knob, when something stopped her. It was the sound of whispering, soft at first, so faint she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. But then it grew, louder, more distinct. It sounded like her name. No, not just her name. The whispers were woven together in a single thread, an unholy chant that twisted and turned, scraping across her mind. Beth, Beth, Beth. The air thickened, the temperature in the room dropping. She could feel the chill creeping up her spine, settling in the base of her neck. Something was reaching out to her. Something was inside the room with her. Panic flooded her chest. Her breath caught, and her heart pounded in her ears. She turned the doorknob so fast that it squealed, and she flung open the door, stepping out of the room and into the hallway. But when she turned to close it behind her, something made her stop. A figure stood in the doorway, a shape tall and indistinct, its edges blurry like a shadow in the dark. It wasn't quite human, not quite anything she could recognize, but it was there, watching her. Her breath hitched in her throat, her body freezing in place. She felt as though her skin was being peeled back, layer by layer, as if the room itself had turned inside out. The figure in the doorway didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting, watching. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her. It knew her. It knew her in a way no one could. The whisper started again, louder this time, closer. Beth backed away, one step, two, her feet stumbling as if they had a mind of their own. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her pulse ringing in her ears. She didn't want to look at it, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she raised her eyes to the figure's face, or where its face should have been. Nothing. The darkness pooled where its features should have been. A void. The shadow consumed the space, leaving nothing but a black, empty hole. And then, in that endless, suffocating silence, it spoke. "You're in the story now, Beth. There's no turning back." Her blood ran cold, and she screamed, but the sound caught in her throat, strangled, as if the room itself was pressing in on her chest. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and fell to the floor. The shadow didn't move. It only remained there, a silent, unblinking witness to her terror. Beth scrambled to her feet, fighting for breath, trying to pull herself together. Her fingers brushed the edges of the wall as she stumbled down the hallway toward the staircase, her pulse erratic, her body drenched in sweat. When she reached the top of the stairs, she turned around, expecting to see the figure still standing there, but it was gone. The hallway was empty, silent. For a moment, she just stood there, her body shaking, her chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. And the house was still. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The silence, the waiting. The story was just beginning, and she was already inside it. Beth sat at her kitchen table, her hands gripping a cold mug of coffee, though it was long since gone cold. She stared at the steam rising from it, watching it curl upward, and wondered what in God's name she had gotten herself into. The words from the mysterious manuscript echoed in her mind, as loud and clear as the gusts of wind that rattled the windows. "You're in the story now, Beth. There's no turning back." The whispering voice still clung to her, an unnerving presence in the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. Her fingers twitched, instinctively reaching toward the drawer where she had hidden the envelope, the one that contained the note, the one that felt like a final warning. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that this was nothing but a bad dream, but the cold dread in her chest refused to leave. And the manuscript, it was like something alive. It felt alive. The pages had haunted her from the moment she'd read the first one, and the deeper she got into it, the more she began to feel as though she were part of it, like her world was sinking into the story, page by page, paragraph by paragraph. Beth had tried to stop reading. Really, she had. But the next night, when the house had been empty, When the storm outside had reached its peak, she had found herself sitting in her study again, the manuscript before her, its strange, disjointed narrative taunting her. It was too compelling, too dangerous to put down. Every line pulled her deeper into its twisted embrace. Every word felt like a promise, a dark secret whispered just for her. The pages had revealed things about her, things she hadn't told anyone, secrets from her childhood, hidden memories she'd long since buried, and the events in the manuscript were starting to mirror her life in ways that terrified her. Last night, as the wind howled and the pages turned, she had read about herself standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the darkness, as if the world itself had split open and shown her the void. And then, as she read, she had felt it. The familiar tug of fear, a cold hand on her shoulder. The world had blurred around her, the lines between fiction and reality fading, until she could no longer tell where one began and the other ended. She had stepped into the story, whether she had wanted to or not. The coffee mug in front of her shook in her hands. She set it down quickly, not trusting herself to hold it steady any longer. Her eyes darted to the doorway of the kitchen, as if she expected to see something, someone waiting there. There had been times in the last few days when she'd been sure she saw shadows moving at the edges of her vision. Not just any shadows, but shapes, figures that weren't supposed to be there. She had called her friend Allison earlier that morning, hoping to escape the growing sense of dread, hoping to hear a voice that was real and tangible. But Allison hadn't answered. She never did, not anymore. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but a deep part of her knew the truth she didn't want to face. Something had changed. The manuscript, that damnable thing, had started affecting more than just her thoughts. It was affecting her reality. Beth's eyes slid over to the envelope in the drawer. She could feel it there, even though she couldn't see it. It was pulling her. Every part of her wanted to walk away, to throw it all in the trash and forget about it. But the thought of it, of abandoning the story, felt worse. The manuscript had become an obsession, a dangerous one. She had to know what would happen next. Without thinking, she stood up, moving toward the study again. The hallway stretched before her like a corridor of endless darkness, the walls seeming to close in, drawing her toward the one place she couldn't escape from. The study door creaked open, its hinges groaning like a living thing, and she stepped inside. The room was colder now, colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed deeper, darker. Beth went straight for the desk where she had left the manuscript. She opened the drawer with a deliberate, almost frantic motion and retrieved the worn pages. Holding them in her hands, she felt a strange electric charge, as though the paper itself was vibrating with energy. She could hear the faintest rustle, like whispers just beneath the surface, but no sound escaped the pages. It was time to continue. She had no choice. She opened the manuscript to where she had left off. The story had taken a strange turn the last time she had read it, something she hadn't expected. The protagonist, who by now seemed more like a shadow of her own life, had found herself in a dark alleyway, chased by something that wasn't human. The feeling of being pursued had been so vivid, so real, that when Beth had turned the page last night, she had sworn she felt someone watching her. And then, out of nowhere, A voice had called her name in the dark. Beth, she shuddered, closing her eyes for a moment. She could feel her pulse quicken, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. It's just a book, just a story, she told herself, but the words felt hollow. She could feel the reality shifting around her, warping, pulling her further in. She turned the page. The inked words on the paper seemed to bleed into each other, growing darker, thicker. There was a chill that spread from the pages, creeping into her bones, making her limbs feel heavy, sluggish. She could feel the words swimming in her mind, swirling around like a fog she couldn't escape. Her heart raced as she read the next line, a line that should have been impossible to understand, a line that could never have been written by anyone else. She opened the study door and stepped inside, but she wasn't alone. Beth's breath hitched. She turned the page faster now, her hand trembling. But before she could read the next line, she heard it, a soft, slow creak from behind her. She froze. The sound came again. A footstep, barely a whisper, but it was enough. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but the room was empty, except for the darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe, waiting. You're not alone, Beth. The words from the manuscript echoed in her mind. You never were. She slammed the book shut, her heart hammering. The air in the room seemed to thicken. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls like living things. She could feel something, someone, standing in the doorway. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Yet she knew. She knew she wasn't alone, and the manuscript had known it before she did. Beth didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. The shadows in her study, the ones that stretched and twisted like serpents on the walls, followed her into the bedroom, their tendrils creeping up the bedposts, curling into the corners of the room. She could feel them even when her eyes were closed. They were waiting, watching. And the voice from the manuscript, the voice that had whispered her name from the page, had been with her every step of the way. It had not left. It refused to leave. It was like an itch in the back of her skull, a compulsion. She had to finish reading. She had to know what came next. And yet, when the morning came, she didn't feel relief. There was no sense of escape, no solace in the sunlight filtering through the curtains. She could barely eat. The food didn't taste right, like it was made from ash. She couldn't concentrate. It was all she could do to drink water, to force down a bite of toast, as she tried to ignore the gnawing sensation growing in her chest. That nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The manuscript, though, it wouldn't leave her alone. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the words. They haunted her like phantoms, wisping through her thoughts, painting the corners of her mind. Each sentence was an arrow, each paragraph a twisting knife. She couldn't fight it any longer. She knew she couldn't. Beth stood up from the table, her breakfast left untouched. The cup of coffee she had made earlier had grown cold, the liquid congealing into a sickly, gray sheen. Her hand was trembling, but not with the cold. She didn't know what it was, but it was there, deep in her stomach. A pulse of dread. A weight. Stop, she muttered aloud. Just stop, Beth. You're just imagining things. She could hear her own voice crack as she said it, but she refused to listen. The voice in her head, the one that called to her, told her she had no choice. She had to finish it. The manuscript. It was calling her. Her steps felt unsteady as she made her way back to the study. Her legs seemed to drag behind her, like they were weighed down by the very air itself. Each step felt like it was pushing her into deeper, darker territory. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to scream, but the manuscript called her forward. The study door groaned as it opened, the hinges screeching with a sound that made her skin crawl. The room inside was as she had left it, silent, save for the faint rustling of paper. It was waiting for her. It was waiting for her. Beth didn't need to look at the desk to know where the manuscript was. She could feel it, calling to her like a lover, an addiction. She reached for it without thinking, her fingers brushing against the edges of the paper. The texture felt like rough skin under her fingertips, the edges fraying as though the pages were not bound by ink, but by something far darker, something far older. She sat down at the desk again. The chair creaked under her weight, the sound somehow louder than it should have been in the stillness of the room. Her breath caught as she flipped open the manuscript to the last page she had read. There, in neat, perfect handwriting, was the continuation of the story. The protagonist, the woman in the story, who was, in some sickening way, her, had stepped out of the study into the hallway. She was walking toward the door that led out of the house, as if trying to escape the dark forces that had begun to suffocate her. The words seemed familiar, too familiar. The door opened with a groan, just as it had before, but this time the world beyond was not the world she knew. It was dark, empty, cold, a vast blackness that swallowed everything in its path. Beth's heart began to beat harder in her chest. Her breath quickened. She was in the story now. The lines had blurred, and she was no longer reading from the manuscript. She was living it. Her eyes darted back to the page. She couldn't look away. She couldn't stop herself. As she stepped into the darkness, she knew that she was no longer alone. She could feel the presence behind her, following her every move, breathing down her neck. It was waiting for her to make a mistake, to turn around, to look back. Beth's hand trembled as she turned the page. It was then that the world around her began to shift. The air grew colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch out toward her, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel them as they moved, just out of the corner of her eye. The walls of the study began to close in, creeping inward, suffocating her. Her breath hitched, and she snapped the manuscript closed, but the room didn't stop moving. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing. The ceiling creaked, as though something heavy had shifted above her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the manuscript in her trembling hands. "Do not look behind you." The words echoed in her mind, and the air in the room grew thick. She heard a whisper, a sound so soft that she thought she might have imagined it, but it wasn't her imagination. She knew that much. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, in the doorway, stood a figure. It was tall, dark, and obscured in shadow. The features were indistinct, blurred, like a figure caught in a fading photograph. But the thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. She could feel it, feel the weight of its presence pressing against her, like a suffocating fog. The air turned stifling, thick with the weight of something ancient and terrible. And then she saw it, just for a split second. Two eyes, glowing faintly, peering through the shadow. They were watching her, waiting. Beth's mouth went dry. The manuscript had lied. It hadn't just been a story. It was her future. Beth didn't scream. Maybe that was the strangest part of it all. The fact that she didn't scream, even when the air seemed to crush her lungs, and the shadow in the doorway stretched its limbs like it was reaching for her. The figure, no, thing, wasn't quite human. It was like the corner of a nightmare, one that had slipped out of the world of dreams and was now spilling into her reality. She didn't move. The room felt colder, the air heavier. The shadows weren't just in the corners now. They were alive. They wrapped themselves around her like a shroud. The manuscript, the one that had started this all, lay open on the desk in front of her, the words dancing on the page like they were trying to escape the paper itself. And then she heard the whisper. It wasn't coming from the figure in the doorway. It wasn't even coming from the manuscript. It was in her head. Look. You have to look. Beth's fingers twitched, and she found herself turning toward the manuscript again, as if something invisible had yanked her hand toward it. She could feel the words on the page tugging at her like threads, pulling her in, forcing her to read. Turn the page. She had no choice. She turned it. The words on the next page were not the one she had been expecting. It was as though they had shifted, contorted. There was no longer any distinction between the narrative of the manuscript and the reality around her. The words described her, described the room, described everything that was happening in real time. The room, the shadows, the thing in the doorway. She knew then that there was no escape. The walls had already closed in. The darkness had already claimed her. Beth's heart pounded harder. She could hear it now, as loud as a drum, echoing in her ears. The thing in the doorway took one slow, measured step forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. The glowing eyes grew brighter, burning through the shadow like a torch. It had been waiting for her. It had always been waiting for her. The figure spoke now. At least she thought it spoke. The sound was guttural, a low rumble, like a growl from the depths of the earth itself. It wasn't words exactly, but something. Something that made her skin crawl. Something that turned her stomach. And still, she didn't scream. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was terrified. No, it was because she had already known this moment was coming. She'd known it the instant she had read the first words of the manuscript. She couldn't remember how long it had been since she'd opened the manuscript. Maybe hours, maybe days. But it felt as if time itself had been stretched thin, like an elastic band pulled to its breaking point. The world felt wrong. The shadows were wrong. The manuscript was wrong. And then, just as her breath hitched in her chest, just as she felt herself sinking into the very fabric of the story itself, Beth made a decision. She closed the manuscript. The room went silent. For a moment, the shadows stopped moving. The thing in the doorway froze. The oppressive air that had been thickening around her seemed to dissipate, as if the very act of closing the book had drawn the darkness back into itself. The walls stopped closing in. The air no longer pressed against her chest like it had a life of its own. Beth stood there, trembling, staring at the manuscript now lying innocuously on the desk. The story was finished. She had closed the book. The words couldn't touch her anymore. She was free, but freedom, she would soon learn, was an illusion. The thing in the doorway didn't disappear. It stepped forward again. This time, its eyes burned bright enough to scorch the air, bright enough to make her vision blur. Its shadow loomed large in the room, darker than any night she had ever known, and its mouth, if it even had a mouth, began to twist upward in what could have been a smile, or something far worse. The thing spoke again, this time in words. "You can't escape. It's too late. You're already mine." Beth's body trembled uncontrollably. Her mind was fighting to comprehend, fighting to run, to do anything to escape, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She was trapped. The words from the manuscript had been right. She had always been a part of the story. It had never been fiction. The shadows swelled. The room, the study, the house itself seemed to grow darker. The air was thick, choking, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was tight. The walls of the room twisted again. A slow, agonizing turn that felt like the world was folding in on itself. And in the silence that followed, there was the unmistakable sound of a page turning. Beth froze. Her heart stopped. She didn't open the manuscript again. She didn't need to. The words had found her. The last page of the manuscript had been torn from the book, leaving only a single line of ink scrawled across the blank page. She would never escape. The story would always end the same way. The walls had closed in on her completely now, the shadows creeping out from the corners, their long, skeletal fingers brushing against her skin, dragging her closer, pulling her down into the very heart of the darkness that had been waiting for her from the beginning. And then there was nothing. The wind that night was like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't a gentle breeze, the kind that rustles the leaves in your yard or sends a slight shiver up your spine. No, this wind felt wrong, sharp, bitter, and unsettling. It curled around corners, screamed down empty streets, and sent dust tumbling across the cracked sidewalks of Pine Hollow. And in the midst of that bitter wind, a strange light started to flicker from the abandoned house at the end of Maple Street. It had been years since anyone had dared go near that house. The place had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, at least since old Mr. Calhoun had died in the early 80s, leaving behind nothing but whispers and speculation. Some folks said he had passed on in his sleep, while others claimed he had been driven mad by the house's atmosphere, drove him to an early grave. The truth, like so many things in Pine Hollow, was buried beneath layers of gossip and unspoken fears. But one thing was certain: no one had lived there for a long time, and yet, on this particular evening, the house was bathed in a dull, pulsing red glow, like the eye of some distant, forgotten beast, awakening from its slumber. It was enough to stir the curiosity of the neighbors, who, for all their careful avoidance, had never quite stopped keeping an eye on the house. There was something about that place, something that gnawed at you from the inside, like a bad memory you could never shake. Benny Harper was the first to notice the light. He had been sitting on his porch, trying to catch what little was left of the evening warmth, sipping on a can of flat beer. His lawnmower was parked on the driveway, still dirty from the afternoon's work. He hadn't noticed the light at first, just a strange, aching emptiness that filled the air like static. It was only when he looked up and noticed the strange reflection in the glass of his front door that he saw it, the red glow, faint at first, but steadily brightening from the house at the end of the street. He squinted, leaning forward in his creaky rocking chair, thinking maybe it was a trick of the wind or a malfunctioning street lamp. But when he wiped his hand across his eyes and looked again. The light was still there, glowing from behind the broken windows of that old, rotting house. And it wasn't the kind of light you'd expect from a bulb. No, this was something else. It flickered like a heartbeat, and every time it pulsed, the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural heaviness. The wind didn't stop. It only howled louder, as if it too was reacting to the light's presence. Benny's throat tightened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Christ," he muttered, not even realizing he'd spoken aloud. The light seemed almost to be breathing. There was a sense of rhythm to it, one beat after another, steady and almost like a countdown. Benny didn't know why, but he felt a sudden urge to find out what was going on. Maybe it was the loneliness of his late 40s or the endless boredom of small-town life, but something compelled him to act. He pushed himself out of the chair, his knees creaking with a protest that made him wince. "Not tonight," he mumbled to himself, wiping the cold sweat from his brow. But as he made his way to the mailbox, he looked back toward the house. The light pulsed again. It was brighter now, a dark, unnatural shade of red that made his heart skip a beat. Something wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. His eyes darted down the street. No one else seemed to be outside. No one except for old Mrs. Winters, who sat in her rocking chair at the far end of the street, staring at her knotted hands. Her presence was always a reminder that life in Pine Hollow didn't change much. Mrs. Winters hadn't left her front porch in years, and people joked she was waiting for the day the world came to an end. As if on cue, she turned her head, her pale eyes narrowing in the direction of the abandoned house. Benny shuddered and pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. There was no mistaking the way Mrs. Winters looked at the house. She wasn't just looking at it. She was seeing something. He hadn't noticed it at first, but Mrs. Winters was rocking faster now. Her hands clutched tightly around the arms of her chair. Benny felt a chill run down his spine. "You see it too, huh?" he called out to her, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the wind. Mrs. Winters didn't respond, but Benny saw her lips move, as if she was speaking to herself. It made him uneasy. "Red light," Benny said aloud, his voice barely audible in the heavy silence. He looked back at the house. Just a damn street light, probably. But the more he said it, the less sure he felt. There was something about the glow, something about the pulse of it that gnawed at his chest. He turned back to the house, then hesitated. What if it wasn't just the light? Behind him, the wind howled, but Benny barely heard it. His attention was fixed on that red glow. That's when he noticed the others. Bobby Sellers and Roy Jensen were standing across the street, their eyes locked on the same place. Benny had never seen the two men stand together unless there was trouble, or worse, a mystery to unravel. Roy scratched the back of his neck, his face tight with concern, while Bobby shifted uncomfortably, as if he were regretting whatever strange decision had led them here. "You two see it?" Benny called out. "Yeah," Roy answered, his voice low. "Something's off, man." The three men stood in a loose circle, all of them silently contemplating the strange phenomenon in front of them. The wind whipped their jackets and tossed their hair around, but none of them moved. They all just stood, transfixed by the eerie glow at the end of the street. "You think it's a prank?" Bobby finally asked. "No," Benny answered firmly. "Pranks don't glow like that." The red light seemed to grow brighter, almost as if it were responding to their attention. The pulse of it grew stronger, filling the street with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The tension in the air was unbearable. "Maybe we should call someone," Roy muttered. But Benny was already shaking his head. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like this was something they had to handle themselves. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the need to see it with his own eyes. Maybe that's why the curiosity was eating at him so badly. "You think this is normal, Roy?" Benny asked, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "This light? It's not right. I've been here long enough to know when something isn't right." Roy glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "It's not normal, but what do we do about it?" Benny chewed on his lip. For a moment, he considered walking away. Hell, they could just leave it alone and pretend they hadn't seen a thing. Pretend the house wasn't alive with that strange, pulsing light. But the thought didn't sit well in his gut. The feeling in the air had changed. There was something darker here, something that demanded an answer. "We go check it out," Benny said, his voice steady despite the unease flooding his mind. "We find out what the hell is going on." There was a long pause. Bobby and Roy exchanged a glance. Bobby stepped forward, his face taut with hesitation, but the need for answers was written all over his expression. "All right," Bobby said, though his voice was uncertain. "We'll do it, but if it gets weird, if it gets too much..." He trailed off, clearly trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Benny nodded, though a cold unease spread through him, like a slow-moving disease. He knew one thing for sure. Whatever that red light was, it wasn't going to stay contained. Whatever was coming, it was coming for all of them, and soon. They began to walk toward the house, their footsteps slow and deliberate, their breath caught in the air like fragile ghosts. The wind died down for a moment, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as they reached the bottom of the street, the red light pulsed again, stronger this time, and the door to the abandoned house creaked open. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, as if the house itself were waking from a long, deep slumber. Benny's stomach twisted. The pulse of the red light beat louder now, its rhythm almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a reflection of the streetlight or some malfunctioning bulb. No, this light had a life of its own, sickly and unnatural. "Did you hear that?" Roy's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break the thick silence that had settled over them. His eyes were wide, his hand gripped tight around the collar of his jacket, as if he could somehow shield himself from whatever was on the other side of that door. Benny didn't answer immediately. He stood there, watching the door, the red light spilling out like blood pooling on the ground. There was something so utterly wrong about it, something that gnawed at the pit of his stomach and crept up his spine. It wasn't just the door that was wrong. It was the way the house stood there in the night, untouched by time. Even after all these years of abandonment, it looked as if it had been waiting for something, for someone. And now, here they were, 3 men standing at the threshold, staring at the mystery. The wind had stopped. The kind of dead silence that followed was the worst of it. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for them to move, or perhaps waiting for something else to happen. Bobby stepped forward, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement. His gaze locked on the dark doorway. He hadn't spoken since Benny suggested they enter. But now, he cleared his throat and muttered, "We should be careful. Maybe we should just knock or something?" There was an edge to his voice, something that suggested he already regretted this whole decision. Benny didn't blame him. He was second-guessing himself now, too. The door creaked again, this time louder, as if something or someone was pushing it open from the other side. The red light pulsed again, and this time Benny could swear it shifted, as if the color deepened and thickened, like a bruise spreading under the skin. "Let's go," Benny said, his voice more determined than he felt. He wasn't about to turn back now. Not with the strange pull of that light. Not with the feeling of eyes, watching. Roy looked at him, then Bobby, then back to Benny. There was a long pause as the wind picked up again, stirring the dead leaves around their feet. It almost seemed to whisper, as though the world itself was trying to warn them. But whatever fear they might have felt, it couldn't stop them now. The door was open, and that red glow continued to pulse in a hypnotic rhythm, pulling them in. "All right," Roy said finally, his voice low and resigned. "Let's do it." They crossed the street together, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, and approached the house. It was worse up close. The building loomed like a shadow, stretching long across the ground. The wood of the porch was rotting away, and the windows, long shattered, let in a cold breeze that sent goosebumps up Benny's arms. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The light seemed to be coming from inside the house, from deep within. The red glow spilled through the open door, staining the air with its unnatural hue. It was more than just light. It felt like a presence, something alive, something waiting. Benny hesitated, but then he pushed the thought away. They had come this far. They had to see it through. The porch creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it, the boards protesting with every footfall. Benny moved first, his hand reaching for the doorknob. His fingers brushed the cool metal, and the door swung inward with a heavy sigh, revealing the darkness beyond. The interior of the house was a shamble of decaying walls and old furniture piled high with dust. A foul, sour smell hit Benny's nose as soon as he crossed the threshold. Something rotten, like food left too long in the fridge, or something far worse. The red light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room, dancing across the walls. It wasn't like a light from a lamp. It was jagged, uneven, like lightning caught in a bottle, only slower, more methodical. It made everything look wrong, warped. Benny stepped farther inside, his breath shallow, his heart racing. His eyes searched the dark corners of the room. Everything was still, too still. No movement, no sign of life. "This place is bad," Bobby muttered from behind him, his voice trembling slightly. Benny didn't respond. His attention was drawn to the far corner of the room, where something moved. At first, Benny thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow shifting in the corner of his vision. But then it moved again, closer this time. Something was there, something alive. He squinted into the shadows, trying to make sense of the darkness. The pulse of the red light grew louder, more intense. It almost seemed to wrap itself around the edges of the room, enveloping everything. It made the walls seem like they were bending inward, like the very air in the house was suffocating him, drawing him deeper into its web. Then, there it was again, a figure, just barely visible in the dim light. A pale shape, hunched and twisted, creeping toward them. "Jesus Christ," Roy whispered, his voice cracking. He took a step back, his boots scraping against the floorboards. Benny's breath caught in his throat. For a second, he couldn't move. He couldn't think. His feet felt like they were stuck in molasses. His body frozen with a fear so pure, it turned his blood to ice. The figure was drawing closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything Benny had ever seen before. The body seemed wrong, twisted in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then the figure stopped. And then it looked at them. Benny couldn't look away. The eyes, or what might have been eyes, were black, like the deepest shadow, endless and hollow, staring into him, through him. There was something alive in those eyes, something ancient and cruel. It spoke, or at least Benny thought it did. It didn't use words. It didn't need to. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a raw, guttural presence that seemed to vibrate in the air, rattling his bones. And then it smiled. But it wasn't a smile, not a grin. It was more like a rift, a crack opening in the fabric of the world itself. "Get out," Benny managed to choke out, his voice trembling. But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them, the red light flickering wildly, and something far worse than just a faulty bulb began to stir. The moment the door slammed shut, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room, replaced by something colder, more suffocating. Benny's chest tightened. The breath caught in his throat like a fist, and he stumbled backward. His back hit the peeling wallpaper with a dull thud, and the foul, rot-scented air filled his nostrils, making him gag. "Get the hell out!" Bobby's voice was high-pitched with panic, but his feet stayed glued to the floor. His eyes darted to the door, which was now locked, a heavy, unyielding barrier between them and freedom. But Benny didn't look away from the figure in the corner. It was still there, the thing, the creature. It hadn't moved, but it didn't need to. Even in the dim light, its presence was suffocating. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. Its black eyes seemed to absorb the light around it, its grin widening, splitting the shadows. It was no longer just a figure in the corner. It was watching them, each of them, one by one, and its smile, that damnable smile, stretched farther, impossibly wide, as if the space inside its mouth was infinite. Benny couldn't look away. His legs felt like stone, his body frozen in place, as if the thing had cast some invisible spell over him. He wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but the words wouldn't come. The air felt too thick, like it was pressing against his lungs, making it harder to breathe. Roy was the first to snap out of it. He broke the stillness with a sudden, sharp gasp and turned on his heels, scrambling toward the door. No, 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 this isn't happening. He yanked at the doorknob, his palms slick with sweat, but the door didn't budge. It was as if the house itself had come alive, its walls closing in, its very foundation locking them inside. "Get out of the way," Bobby shouted, pulling Roy aside. He slammed his shoulder against the door, gritting his teeth as he tried to force it open. His efforts were futile. The door held firm, its thick wooden frame unyielding to their panic. Benny couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. His eyes stayed fixed on the creature as it took one slow, deliberate step forward, its body bending and contorting in ways that were far from natural. It made a low sound, a hum almost, like the quiet buzz of a hive full of bees, distant yet all-encompassing. The sound seemed to vibrate through his bones, pulling at something deep inside him. "Get it off," Bobby gasped, his breath coming in ragged, frantic bursts. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," Roy choked out, his voice cracking. He looked desperately around the room, as if searching for an escape, but the walls closed in on them, the light growing brighter, more intense. "We need to leave, now." But Benny's legs wouldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground as the creature in front of them moved closer. It wasn't walking, not really. Its limbs jerked in unnatural angles, bending and shifting like a broken marionette being controlled by some unseen force. It was getting closer, and Benny could feel it in his gut, in the very air around them. That growing presence, that hunger. The red light pulsed again, faster now, as if it were reacting to the tension in the room. The air thickened, weighed down with the pressure of something alive, something that wasn't human. "Benny," Roy whispered, his voice trembling. "Get it together. We have to go. Now." But Benny couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. He could feel his pulse quicken, his heart slamming against his rib cage, as the thing's black eyes seemed to reach inside him, digging into his very soul. It was suffocating, more than fear. It was as if the thing was looking for something it could use, something it could feed on. The creature didn't speak, but its mouth opened wider, wider than any human mouth could, and the sound that came from it was not a voice, not a word. It was an echo, an endless echo of 1,000 voices, all wailing in agony. It sounded like the voices of the dead, like the souls of the lost, crying out from the depths of some terrible abyss. Benny stumbled backward, his knees shaking. He almost tripped over the rotting floorboards. No, I can't." And then, just as he thought he might collapse, just as he felt the pull of the thing inside his chest, there was a loud bang, like a gunshot in the silence. The thing jerked back, its head snapping toward the door with a horrible screech. A sudden flood of light, bright, white, blinding, blasted into the room from the direction of the door. It was so intense that Benny had to shield his eyes. Through the harsh glare, Benny could just make out a figure standing at the threshold. Tall, broad-shouldered. His hand was raised, and he was holding something. A flashlight. A gun. Benny couldn't be sure. The figure stepped inside, his voice booming. "Everyone get back." Now it was a man's voice. Deep, commanding, with a calmness that stood in sharp contrast to the terror in the room. Benny didn't recognize him. In fact, he couldn't quite make out any of his features through the blinding light. But there was something about the way he moved, something about the way the creature flinched as he stepped forward, that told Benny this man wasn't here by accident. The red light flickered once more, a final pulse before it dimmed, slowly dying down to a faint glow, and for a moment everything seemed to hold still. Benny blinked, his heart hammering in his chest. Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he raised his flashlight, casting a harsh beam over the room. The creature had disappeared, gone, vanished without a trace, as if it had never been there in the first place. The man stepped farther into the house, his boots heavy against the rotting wood. "Doesn't matter who I am," he said quietly, his voice now tinged with a cold edge. "What matters is that you get the hell out of here, all of you." Roy blinked, his mouth working in disbelief. What the hell's going on here? What was that thing? Where did it go? The man looked around the room, his eyes sharp, calculating. It's not gone. Not yet. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, metallic, and dark. Something that looked like a pendant, or maybe a medallion. The red light, he said, his voice low. It's a warning, a lure. It's trying to drag you in. Bobby stepped back, eyes wide. What are you talking about? Lure us in, for what? The man's eyes met Benny's, cold and unwavering. For you. The air in the house still hummed with an eerie tension, but the creature was gone. At least that's what Benny tried to convince himself of. He could feel the heaviness lift from his chest, the suffocating weight of fear that had been pressing down on him for what felt like hours. But something was still wrong. Something in the air, something in the man's eyes. The stranger had spoken like someone who knew exactly what was going on, as though he'd seen this before, and yet Benny still couldn't make sense of what he'd said. For you. The words echoed in his mind like a dull drum beat. You're telling me this light, Bobby said, his voice shaky, is a trap for us? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his boots creaking against the rotting wood as he scanned the surroundings, eyes flicking from the broken furniture to the walls. It was as though he was searching for something that Benny couldn't see. The light from the flashlight flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls, making everything seem more alive than it had a second ago. I didn't say it was a trap for you, the man said after a moment, his voice low, almost too calm. I said it was a lure, a signal. A signal for what? Roy asked, his voice strained. He looked at the man like a dog that had just been shown a new bone, unsure whether to bark or bite. The stranger's presence, calm yet deadly, set something off in Roy. He didn't trust him. The man turned toward him then, his eyes narrowing, cold and calculating. For what's coming? You've already crossed the line. Now you'll feel it. Benny's skin prickled. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight. There was something in the way the man spoke, something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the weight behind them, the certainty that he knew exactly what was happening while they were stumbling in the dark. But we didn't ask for any of this, Bobby said, his voice trembling. He looked toward Benny, his eyes wide with panic. We just saw a light. We thought it was some kid screwing around. That's all. We didn't know this was... He gestured to the empty space where the creature had been, his voice cracking. The man didn't answer right away, his attention still sweeping the room, pausing momentarily at the broken window, the decaying furniture, and then the corner where the creature had been. The thing had vanished so quickly, so completely, that Benny wasn't sure if it had ever truly been there. Had they all imagined it? Had it been some trick of the mind, conjured by the oppressive weight of fear? But no, he couldn't shake the image of those black eyes, the endless void behind them, the smile that had split the creature's face open like some kind of grotesque wound. I'm not here to explain things to you, the stranger finally said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I'm here to help you survive. Roy snorted, his frustration bubbling over. Survive? From what? That thing. What the hell is it? The man's eyes flicked to Roy. That thing isn't even the worst of it. Benny swallowed hard. Not the worst. He could feel the blood drain from his face. He thought of the creature, how it had moved, how it had looked at them, how it had waited. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. "Then what is?" Bobby asked, his voice small now. There was a desperation in it, like he was begging for the truth, for some kind of solid ground beneath his feet. The stranger didn't answer at first. He just stared at Bobby with that cold, calculating gaze. The light from the flashlight reflected in his eyes, making them gleam with a predatory glint. "It's not the light that's dangerous," the man said, his voice hard. "It's what it attracts." Benny didn't understand. "What do you mean?" The stranger's gaze flicked to Benny, and for the first time, Benny saw something that looked like pity in his eyes, but it wasn't comforting. It made his stomach turn. "Do you know what happened here?" the man asked, his voice low and controlled. Benny glanced around at the decaying house, at the rotting floorboards, the broken windows. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, maybe decades. The smell of decay was thick in the air, as if the house itself were dying. "What happened here?" Roy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man exhaled slowly, like he was preparing to say something that would make all of them wish they were anywhere but here. "This house is a beacon," he said quietly, his voice steady but grim. "A signal for something much older, something much darker." Benny felt his breath catch in his chest. "What are you talking about?" The man's eyes narrowed. "There's an ancient evil in this town, something that's been dormant for years, maybe longer. The light, the red light, it's not some malfunctioning bulb. It's the calling card, the signal that they're ready to come back." Benny's head spun. "Who?" The man's expression darkened, and his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The things that live in the dark, the things that feed on fear, the things you never want to meet." Bobby took a step back, his face pale. We're in danger, aren't we?" The stranger looked at Bobby, his eyes full of sorrow. "Number, you're already too late for that. You already let them in." Before any of them could react, a deafening sound, like a thunderclap, ripped through the silence of the room. It came from deep within the house, from the farthest corner of the darkness. It echoed through the walls, shaking the floor beneath their feet. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand reaching into his coat once more. His fingers closed around the medallion-like object he had been holding earlier. The same one that seemed to glow faintly now, pulsing in time with the distant noise. Benny looked at him, his heart hammering in his chest. "What is that?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the center of the room, turning his back to them. He raised the object high, and for a split second, Benny thought he saw something dark, move in the shadows beyond him. The man spoke, his voice calm, almost serene, despite the chaos around them. "It's time for you to leave," he said. "But first, you have to understand what's coming." The room felt colder, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones and stays there, crawling beneath your skin, gnawing at you from the inside out. Benny could hear the pounding of his heart in his ears, the rapid staccato rhythm, a constant reminder that he wasn't imagining the terror he was feeling. It was real, all of it. The floor trembled again, a deep, unsettling vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't just the house. It was the ground beneath them, the earth shifting as if something huge, something monstrous, was rising. Roy's voice cut through the tension, barely audible over the low, rumbling hum. What the hell is that sound? Bobby had backed himself into a corner, eyes wide, his breathing ragged. This is crazy. We need to get out. Now. But the stranger wasn't moving. He stood in the center of the room, medallion held high, his face set in grim determination. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something only he seemed to see. His mouth twisted into a grimace as he whispered something beneath his breath, too quiet for Benny to make out. I told you. The stranger's voice rose, cutting through the low hum. You've already let them in. The red light was just the beginning. They're coming. Benny felt a weight in his chest, a pressure building inside him, as though something had taken root within him, crawling its way into his soul. The air in the room grew thick, stifling. Every breath felt like it was choking him. What the hell do you mean? Benny demanded, his voice trembling despite himself. He didn't care about the fear anymore. He needed answers. He needed to understand why they were here, why the red light had been calling to them. He felt the urgency in the man's words, like a ticking clock in his ears. The stranger's eyes snapped to him then, his gaze sharp and unyielding. It's the price you pay, he said. The price for curiosity, for looking. Looking? Bobby scoffed from the corner, still trembling. We didn't ask for any of this. We didn't even know the damn light was a thing until tonight. The stranger's lips parted, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. The house is a door. It's always been a door. And now, it's open. Benny's mind was racing. A door. He glanced around at the house, at the peeling wallpaper, the rotting beams, the crumbling stairs. How could this house be a door? A door to what? To where? The ground shook again, and this time, the house didn't just groan. It screamed. A long, agonizing sound, as if the very foundation was being torn apart. Something beneath them was breaking free. The walls rattled with the force of it, as though something enormous, something alive, was forcing its way into their reality. Do you hear that? Roy asked, voice shaking as his eyes darted nervously around the room. What the hell is it? I told you, the stranger growled, his voice now filled with something else, something darker, a warning. It's them. They've been waiting for too long. Benny's heart raced, his breath coming in short gasps. Who? Who has been waiting? The stranger turned then, his eyes locking onto Benny's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The ones who came before, the ones who never left. And then, as if on cue, the house seemed to scream again, louder this time, shaking the very air around them. The walls cracked, the floorboards splintered. Benny staggered back, his body trembling. Roy and Bobby weren't far behind, their eyes wide with terror. And then, through the cracks in the walls, through the cracks in their own reality, Benny saw something move. It was like a shadow at first, nothing but a shifting blackness that seemed to bleed from the edges of the walls. But then it took form, a long, twisted figure, like a man, but not. Its body rippled in ways that no human body could. Its limbs were long and thin, like tendrils, stretching out at odd angles, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was a mass of writhing darkness, with tiny, gleaming eyes scattered across it like pinpricks of light. Benny's stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The thing called to him, its presence like a weight around his throat, squeezing tighter with every passing second. His legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath him at any moment. Get out, the stranger shouted. Get out now. But it was too late. The creature, the thing, moved forward with a speed that defied logic. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It shifted, its limbs elongating, bending impossibly as it reached for them. And as it did, the red light flared brighter, searing into their eyes, burning into their very souls. "Go!" the stranger shouted again, this time with a force that shook the air around them. Benny didn't need another command. Without thinking, without waiting, he turned and bolted. His feet pounded against the floor, his breath ragged as he sprinted toward the door that had never seemed so far away. He could hear the others behind him, their footsteps slapping against the ground in frantic panic. But even as they ran, Benny felt the ground shift beneath him, felt the house itself moving, groaning, as though the walls were bending in on them. The door loomed ahead, but it wasn't enough. The thing, the creature, was closer now. Benny could hear its twisted, scraping movement, could feel its dark presence encroaching on him. He reached the door, his fingers fumbling for the knob. Why won't it open? He thought. His mind screamed for him to move, to get away. But the door wouldn't budge. A sound. No, a scream ripped through the room. It was high-pitched, full of agony. The thing was upon them. Its limbs reached out like shadows, long and twisted, grabbing at the air, pulling them in. And then, everything went black. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this chilling story. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a new story. And stay tuned for even more eerie adventures. Sleep tight, if you dare.